I walked into the courtroom ready to lose everything. My cheating husband smirked as he demanded our $1 million mansion, his family company, and full custody of our 2 children. From the gallery, his mother laughed out loud and pointed at my cheap suit. But when my own mother leaned over and whispered to give him exactly what he wants, I did not cry. I picked up the pen and signed my entire life away. They celebrated their ultimate victory, completely unaware that the ink on that paper was about to send them straight to federal prison. Before I tell you how a single signature destroyed them all, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you love seeing arrogant people get exactly what they deserve. My name is Maddie, and I am 33 years old. I work as a forensic accountant tracking down missing money and uncovering financial fraud for a living. I am trained to look past the lies people tell and focus entirely on the numbers, because numbers never lie. But for the longest time, I was completely blind to the deception happening inside my own home. The King County Family Court felt like a freezer that morning. The heavy oak doors closed behind me with a loud thud, sealing me inside with the people who had made my life a living nightmare. The room smelled of stale coffee and floor wax, a sterile environment for the dismantling of a marriage. Across the glossy wooden table sat Donovan, my soon-to-be ex-husband. He was 35 years old, wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit that cost more than my first car. He was the director of his family import-export business, a title he flaunted like a royal crown. Today he looked incredibly smug. He leaned back in his leather chair, whispering jokes to his overpriced shark of a lawyer, a man whose hourly rate was designed to intimidate people like me into submission. Donovan felt invincible. He thought he held all the cards, and his body language screamed absolute contempt for me. Behind the wooden partition separating the gallery from the main floor sat my mother-in-law, Beatrice. At 62 years old, Beatrice was the living embodiment of new money arrogance. She wore a thick fur coat despite the mild Seattle weather and dripped in heavy gold jewelry. Sitting right next to her, chewing gum loudly and scrolling through her phone, was Brittany. Brittany was 25 years old. She was Donovan's mistress. The fact that Beatrice had brought Brittany to my divorce hearing was a calculated insult, a deliberate slap in the face meant to break my spirit. Beatrice leaned over the railing, pointing at my simple gray blazer, and let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed off the high courtroom ceiling. The bailiff shot her a warning glare, but Beatrice simply waved her manicured hand and continued whispering loudly to Brittany about how I was finally getting thrown out with the trash. They wanted me to feel small. They wanted me to feel utterly defeated. Donovan's lawyer cleared his throat and slid a massive phone book-sized stack of legal documents across the table toward me. The binding was thick, the pages dense with suffocating legal jargon. The lawyer began to outline the terms of the settlement, and each demand was more absurd and vicious than the last. Donovan was demanding sole ownership of our $1.5 million mansion in Bellevue. He wanted 100% of the shares in his family import-export company, claiming my contributions over the years meant absolutely nothing. But the most devastating blow was his final demand. Donovan wanted primary physical custody of our 2 children, Leo, who is 8, and Sophie, who is 6. He did not want custody because he loved being a father. He rarely spent time with them anyway. He wanted custody to guarantee that he would not have to pay me a single dime in child support. He wanted to leave me completely destitute, homeless, and separated from my babies. It was a strategy designed for maximum cruelty. I stared at the towering stack of papers. My hands felt cold, but my mind was remarkably clear. A few months ago, this moment would have broken me. I would have begged, cried, and fought a losing battle against a man with bottomless financial resources. I would have panicked at the thought of losing my children, even for a single night. But today, I was not the terrified, betrayed wife they thought I was. I was a forensic accountant who had spent weeks digging into their deepest, darkest secrets. I knew things that could collapse their entire empire. Sitting right beside me was my mother, Helen. At 60 years old, she had recently retired after a 30-year career as a senior investigator for the Internal Revenue Service. She had seen every trick, every scam, and every arrogant criminal in the book. As Donovan's lawyer finished reading the outrageous terms, my own appointed attorney looked at me with deep concern, ready to object to the ridiculous demands. Before he could speak, my mother reached under the heavy oak table. Her hand clamped down on my knee with an iron grip. She leaned in close, her voice a low, steady whisper that only I could hear over the hum of the courtroom air conditioning. "Give him everything. Let them take the bait." I took a slow, deep breath. The hardest part of this plan was accepting the temporary loss of primary custody. It went against every maternal instinct I possessed. But Helen and I had discussed this late into the night. It was a necessary sacrifice. I had to let Donovan take the children temporarily, to keep them safely away from the explosive federal raid I knew was coming. I was playing a long game, a game of chess where losing a few pieces was required to checkmate the king. I looked across the table at Donovan. He raised his eyebrows, a victorious smirk playing on his lips. He mouthed the words, "Sign it, loser." I picked up the heavy black pen provided by the court. I did not hesitate. I flipped directly to the final signature page of that massive document. Donovan's lawyer watched me like a hawk, his eyes gleaming with predatory satisfaction. I signed my name with smooth, deliberate strokes. I signed away the mansion. I signed away the company. I signed away my immediate right to primary custody. I handed the pen back and pushed the stack of papers across the polished wood. The moment the paperwork crossed the table, the courtroom erupted in muted celebration from the opposing side. Donovan pumped his fist under the table. Beatrice actually clapped her hands together in the gallery, pulling Brittany into a triumphant hug. They had won. They had successfully crushed the middle-class girl who never deserved their precious son. Or so they thought. The judge finalized the decree with a strike of his gavel. As I stood up buttoning my simple gray blazer, I looked at their celebrating faces and hid a cold, sharp smile. They were so blinded by their greed and their intense hatred for me that they had completely neglected to read the fine print. They were so eager to take everything I had that neither Donovan nor his expensive lawyer had bothered to thoroughly review the final few pages of that massive stack of documents. They had absolutely no idea about Appendix 4B, a tiny buried clause that my mother and I had meticulously crafted. They thought they had just ruined my life, but in reality, they had just signed their own death warrants. The heavy mahogany doors of the courtroom swung shut behind my mother and me with a resounding thud. The hallway of the King County Family Court was lined with polished marble floors that echoed every single footstep. It was a cold and unforgiving space where families usually fell apart in tears and bitter arguments. Today, however, it was the designated stage for my ex-husband to take his victory lap. I had barely taken 10 steps toward the elevator when I heard the sharp rhythmic clicking of expensive heels approaching rapidly from behind. "Leaving so soon, Madeline?" Beatrice called out, her voice intentionally loud enough to turn the heads of passing lawyers and security guards. I stopped and turned around slowly. Beatrice was marching toward us, her heavy fur coat draped over her shoulders, looking utterly ridiculous inside a heated government building. Donovan was right beside her, practically strutting down the hallway with his chest puffed out. His arm was wrapped tightly around Brittany's waist. Brittany was busy chewing her gum, looking me up and down as if I were a piece of garbage stuck to the bottom of her designer shoe. "I just wanted to say thank you," Beatrice sneered, stopping just inches from my face. "Thank you for finally realizing you never belonged in our world. You can take off that tragic little gray blazer now. You do not have to pretend to be a high society wife anymore. You can go back to being exactly what you always were. A boring middle-class bean counter with no style and no money." My mother Helen stiffened beside me. I felt her arm tense, ready to unleash 30 years of seasoned IRS investigator fury onto this arrogant fake socialite. I gently reached out and gripped my mother's wrist, giving it a firm, silent squeeze. "Do not engage. Do not give them the satisfaction." I looked directly into Beatrice's heavily Botoxed face and maintained a perfectly neutral expression. My absolute silence only seemed to embolden them. Donovan stepped forward, removing his arm from Brittany to cross his arms over his chest. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and absolute disgust. "You really thought you could fight me, didn't you?" He laughed, a harsh grating sound that echoed down the corridor. You actually thought a low-level auditor could outsmart my legal team. I told you from the very beginning that I would crush you. I took the house. I took the business. I even took the kids. And the absolute best part is, I am not paying you a single cent in alimony or child support. You are walking out of this marriage with exactly what you brought into it, nothing. Brittany giggled, leaning her head against Donovan's shoulder. Don't be too mean to her, babe, she whined in a sickeningly sweet tone. She has to go find a cheap apartment to rent now. Maybe she can afford a nice cardboard box downtown. The three of them burst into laughter, completely unashamed of their cruelty in the middle of a public courthouse. I stood there with both hands firmly grasping the handles of my simple leather purse. Inside that purse was my copy of the finalized divorce decree, the very document they were currently celebrating. Donovan leaned in closer, invading my personal space, trying desperately to provoke a reaction. He wanted me to scream. He wanted me to cry. He wanted me to drop to my knees and beg for access to my own children. You are going to miss the mansion, Maddie, Donovan whispered, his breath smelling of stale coffee and expensive mints. You are going to miss the luxury cars and the lavish vacations, but most of all, you are going to miss waking up next to a real man. Have a nice life crunching numbers in a cubicle while Brittany and I sleep in the master suite. I looked at his smug, handsome face and felt absolutely nothing. No heartbreak, no anger, no despair. Just a profound, icy clarity. I did not speak a single word in response to their vicious taunts. I did not need to. When a narcissist tries to destroy you, your absolute silence is the loudest weapon you can use. My mind was already racing ahead, analyzing the brilliant, fatal mistake they had just made. Arrogance is a disease that blinds people to the details. Donovan and Beatrice were so obsessed with the illusion of wealth, so desperate to strip me of everything, that they only looked at the bold print on the first page of the settlement. They saw the words full ownership and primary custody and immediately stopped reading. They were too cheap to pay their shark of a lawyer for an extra hour to review the final addendums we submitted late last night. They assumed I was just a weak, defeated woman throwing in the towel because I was out of money and out of options. They did not understand what a forensic accountant actually does. I spend my entire life reading the fine print. I hunt for the hidden numbers, the buried clauses, the invisible traps that criminals leave behind. And I had left a massive, inescapable trap right at the bottom of that stack of papers. Hidden behind pages of standard legal jargon was Appendix 4B. It was a simple, unassuming page, but that single page was a legally binding indemnification clause. It clearly stated that by taking sole ownership of the family import-export company and the Bellevue mansion, Donovan willingly and knowingly assumed 100% of all financial, civil, and criminal liabilities attached to those assets. He took on all past, present, and future debts. He took on all tax penalties. He completely exonerated me from any connection to the business operations. Donovan thought he was walking away with a gold mine. He had absolutely no idea that he had just signed his name as the sole responsible party for a massive multi-million-dollar federal fraud operation. He had just handed me total legal immunity on a silver platter, all while paying his own lawyer to facilitate it. We are done here, I said, my voice steady and cold. I turned away from them, linking my arms securely through my mother's. That is right, walk away, Beatrice shouted down the hallway as we headed for the elevator. And do not ever try to come back begging for a handout. I pressed the elevator button. The doors slid open with a quiet ding. Helen and I stepped inside, turning around to face the hallway one last time. Donovan was pulling Brittany in for a kiss while Beatrice proudly adjusted her fur coat, basking in her perceived victory. The elevator doors began to close, slicing through the visual of their celebration. As the heavy metal doors sealed shut, Helen finally let out a long, deep breath. She looked at me, a sharp, knowing glint in her eyes. I looked back at her and allowed the cold, calculating smile I had been hiding all morning to finally reach my face. Let them enjoy their mansion and their stolen wealth for the weekend. The countdown had officially begun. Exactly 72 hours earlier, I had stood in the center of that very same Bellevue mansion, feeling my entire world shatter into a million jagged pieces. It was a Tuesday evening and the sky was already dark with the heavy Seattle rain. I had just wrapped up a grueling week-long audit for a corporate client. Exhausted but relieved, I decided to come home early to surprise my husband. I had even stopped at his favorite bakery to pick up a dessert, foolishly thinking we could spend a quiet evening together before picking up Leo and Sophie from their after-school program. I unlocked the heavy front door and stepped into the foyer. The house was unusually quiet, but immediately my senses were assaulted by something entirely wrong. There was a bright pink sequined handbag slung carelessly over the antique entryway table. The air was thick with the scent of cheap, overwhelmingly sweet vanilla perfume. It was a fragrance I would never wear. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. I set the bakery box down and walked up the grand, curving staircase, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. As I approached the master bedroom, I heard a sound that made my blood run completely cold. It was a high-pitched, breathless giggle, followed by Donovan's deep, familiar laugh. I did not hesitate. I pushed the heavy mahogany door open. The sight before me was a cliché straight out of a cheap soap opera, but the pain it inflicted was terrifyingly real. Donovan was sitting on the edge of our king-sized bed, his tie undone, while Brittany frantically scrambled to pull her cocktail dress over her head. She looked at me with wide, panicked eyes, grabbed her heels, and practically sprinted past me down the hallway without saying a single word. I stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the man I had vowed to spend the rest of my life with. I expected him to jump up. I expected him to panic, to apologize, to drop to his knees, and beg for my forgiveness. Instead, Donovan casually stood up and began buttoning his expensive dress shirt. He did not look ashamed. He looked annoyed. "You are supposed to be at the office until 8, Donovan said, his voice flat and completely devoid of guilt. "You brought a woman into our home," I whispered, my voice trembling with a mixture of shock and rising fury. "Into the bed where we sleep, while our children are at their after-school program." Donovan rolled his eyes and let out a heavy sigh, as if I were a nagging child throwing a tantrum over nothing. He walked over to his dresser and strapped on his luxury watch. "Oh, please, Maddie, do not play the victim here," he snapped. "Look at yourself. Look at this marriage. What did you honestly expect to happen?" I felt the floor tilt beneath my feet. He was actually blaming me. I expected loyalty. I shot back, my hands curling into fists. I expected my husband to keep his vows. "Vows require two people to be present," Donovan sneered, turning to face me. "When was the last time you were actually present in this house? You are a ghost, Maddie. You are completely obsessed with your job. You work 60-hour weeks digging through other people's financial trash. You come home exhausted. You smell like stale coffee and you bring your spreadsheets to bed. You never come to my company galas. You never entertain my clients. You are cold, calculating, and completely emotionally unavailable. I am a successful man with a growing empire. I need a woman who actually pays attention to me, not a forensic accountant who treats our marriage like a tax audit." The sheer audacity of his words left me breathless. He was gaslighting me with masterful precision. He was twisting his own disgusting betrayal into a direct consequence of my ambition and hard work. He was weaponizing my career to excuse his lack of basic morality. Before I could even formulate a response, the sound of the front door opening echoed up the stairs. Heavy, rhythmic footsteps clicked against the hardwood floor. A moment later, Beatrice appeared in the bedroom doorway. She had a spare key and treated our home like her personal kingdom. She took one look at my pale, devastated face and then looked at Donovan, who was calmly tucking in his shirt. She completely ignored the fact that another woman's heavy perfume was still lingering in the air. "I saw that tacky little girl running out the front door," Beatrice said casually, adjusting her diamond necklace. She turned her cold, calculating gaze onto me. "I suppose you finally caught them." "You knew," I gasped, the betrayal compounding and suffocating me. "You knew he was bringing a mistress into my home around your own grandchildren." Beatrice scoffed, looking at me as if I were completely insane. She crossed her arms and stepped fully into the bedroom, standing shoulder to shoulder with her son. Do not raise your voice at me, Madeline, Beatrice commanded, and do not act so surprised. Donovan is a vibrant, wealthy, powerful man in the prime of his life. He has needs that you have spectacularly failed to meet. You are an entirely inadequate wife and mother. I stared at her, my mouth open in disbelief. You have always been a disappointment, Beatrice continued, her voice dripping with venom. You come from a mediocre middle-class family of government workers. You have no class, no grace, and no understanding of how to support a man of Donovan's stature. Instead of staying home and cultivating a high society household, you insist on chasing this ridiculous masculine career. You hoard your little paychecks and neglect your husband. Brittany is young, she is beautiful, and she knows how to make my son feel like a king. You brought this entirely on yourself, Madeline. If you had been half the woman Donovan needed, he never would have strayed. They stood there, a united front of pure, unadulterated toxicity. They were entirely convinced of their own twisted reality. In their minds, I was the villain for working hard, and Donovan was the victim who had been forced into the arms of a 25-year-old girl. They expected me to break down. They expected me to cry, to apologize for being a bad wife, to beg Donovan to stay and promise I would quit my job to serve him better. But as I looked at their smug, arrogant faces, the tears never came. The devastating pain of heartbreak evaporated, replaced immediately by an icy, razor-sharp focus. My forensic accounting brain, the very thing they despised, kicked into high gear. I analyzed the situation with cold detachment. I saw their utter lack of empathy. I saw their staggering entitlement. I realized right then and there that I could never fight them with emotions or tears. Narcissists feed on emotional pain. If I wanted to survive, and more importantly, if I wanted to protect Leo and Sophie from growing up in this cycle of abuse, I had to destroy them completely. I had to hit them where it would actually cause them pain. I had to hit their bank accounts. I took one last look at my husband and my mother-in-law. I turned around and walked out of the master's suite in absolute silence. I marched down the grand staircase, grabbed my keys, and walked out the front door into the pouring rain. They thought they had won the argument. They had no idea they had just declared war on a woman who knew exactly how to dismantle their entire existence. I drove through the pouring Seattle rain, my hands gripping the steering wheel with absolute certainty. The tears that usually accompany the end of a marriage were entirely absent. They had been replaced by a cold, surgical focus. My first stop was my mother's house. I needed to ensure Leo and Sophie were safe and completely insulated from the toxic fallout I was about to initiate. I told my mother I had an emergency audit at work and asked her to keep the kids for the night. She took one look at my face and agreed without asking a single question. With my children safe, I drove back to the Bellevue mansion. The house was pitch black when I pulled into the driveway. Donovan and Beatrice were gone, likely out celebrating his newfound freedom with his young mistress. The mansion felt like a tomb, but to me, it was now an active crime scene. I bypassed the master bedroom completely and walked directly into Donovan's lavish home office. It was a monument to his fragile ego, complete with a massive mahogany desk and walls lined with meaningless industry awards. But I was not looking at the expensive decor. I was looking at his computer. During our first year of marriage, before the extreme wealth and the arrogance completely took over their personalities, I had helped Donovan set up the basic accounting software for his family import-export business. He had never bothered to change the master administrative passwords. He was far too lazy, and he always assumed I was too boring and compliant to ever snoop through his things. I booted up the desktop and logged into the shared marital server. My original goal was simple and standard for any impending divorce. I wanted to gather our financial documents. I needed bank statements, tax returns, and property deeds to ensure I secured fair child support for Leo and Sophie. I pulled up the primary corporate ledgers and began exporting the files to an encrypted external hard drive I always carried in my work bag. But as the rows of numbers scrolled across the glowing screen, my professional instincts flared to life. I have spent my entire career as a forensic accountant tracking financial anomalies for massive corporations. My brain is hardwired to spot patterns that do not belong, and the patterns on Donovan's screen were screaming at me. As I cross-referenced the business expenses with our personal banking records, a glaring discrepancy jumped out. The import-export company was showing massive recurring monthly payouts to a logistics vendor based in the Cayman Islands. I dug deeper into the vendor files, my eyes scanning the digital paperwork. The invoices were perfectly formatted with professional logos, but they lacked the essential corresponding shipping manifests. There were no tracking numbers, no customs declarations, and no freight receipts. They were billing for international freight services that never actually occurred. Donovan and Beatrice were paying hundreds of thousands of dollars a month to ghost companies. My heart beat with a steady, rhythmic thud as I opened the corporate tax returns from the previous 3 years. I placed them side by side on the dual monitors next to the internal gross revenue spreadsheets. My breath hitched in my throat as the staggering truth revealed itself. There were 2 completely different sets of books. One set of books painted a picture of a moderately successful business, making just enough profit to justify their comfortable lifestyle to the Internal Revenue Service. It showed modest gains and standard operational costs. But the other set of books, hidden deep in a restricted subfolder labeled Operations, showed the terrifying reality. The legitimate side of the business was bleeding cash. It was operating at a massive, unsustainable deficit. They were barely importing or exporting anything of actual value. So how were they affording the luxury cars, the designer clothes, the excessive jewelry, and this sprawling mansion? I traced the origin of the funds funneling into their personal executive accounts. The money was not coming from legitimate sales revenue. It was being washed through those offshore ghost vendors and cycled back into domestic accounts under the guise of foreign capital investments. They were laundering money. Furthermore, I found documents showing they had repeatedly leveraged our family home, the house where my children slept, to secure fraudulent commercial business loans to keep their shell game running. Donovan and his mother were not brilliant business minds. They were white-collar criminals running a highly illegal financial syndicate. They had built a house of cards on a foundation of federal tax evasion and wire fraud. I sat back in the leather chair, staring at the glowing monitors illuminating the dark room. The personal betrayal of Donovan's affair completely evaporated from my mind, replaced by the sheer exhilarating magnitude of the weapon I had just uncovered. This was no longer a simple family court dispute over a cheating husband and alimony payments. This was a massive federal crime. I highlighted the entire master directory, dragged it onto my encrypted hard drive, and watched the progress bar fill up with every single piece of evidence I would ever need. Donovan wanted to treat our marriage like a tax audit. He wanted to play dirty and leave me with nothing. But he had absolutely no idea that he had just handed a loaded gun to a woman who knew exactly where to aim. I ejected the hard drive, slipped it into my purse, and powered down the computer. The forensic investigation had just begun, and I was going to follow every single penny. I drove straight to the 24-hour electronics store and purchased a brand new clean laptop. I paid in cash. If I was going to map out a multi-million-dollar federal crime syndicate, I was not going to do it on a device that Donovan could ever legally trace or subpoena. I checked into a cheap anonymous motel near the highway, locked the deadbolt, and brewed a pot of terrible black coffee. I plugged my encrypted hard drive into the new machine. For the next 36 hours, I did not sleep. I did not eat. I became a machine processing data at a speed fueled by pure, unadulterated betrayal. The deeper I dug into the corporate network of Donovan's family business, the more breathtaking the criminal conspiracy became. Beatrice had always paraded around Seattle acting like a brilliant matriarch of a legitimate shipping empire. In reality, she was the architect of a classic, highly illegal placement and layering scheme. The family import-export business was nothing but a hollow shell, a sophisticated washing machine for dirty money. Here is how their scam worked. The company would claim to purchase massive shipments of high-end textiles and luxury goods from overseas suppliers. They generated beautiful fake invoices for these phantom shipments and wired millions of dollars out of their domestic accounts to pay for them. The money was routed directly into accounts in the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas. But those offshore suppliers did not actually exist. They were dummy corporations set up by Beatrice. Once the money was sitting in the offshore accounts, the layering process began. Donovan would authorize a series of complex, rapid-fire electronic wire transfers, moving the funds between a dozen different international shell companies. This deliberate labyrinth of transactions was designed specifically to confuse auditors and obscure the original source of the funds. This process constituted textbook federal wire fraud. Finally, the integration phase brought the money back home. Those same offshore ghost companies would suddenly turn around and invest heavily in Donovan's local business ventures, or they would pay him exorbitant consulting fees. To the untrained eye, it looked like Donovan was an international business genius attracting foreign capital. To a forensic accountant, it was clear that he was simply paying himself with his own illegally transferred money, scrubbing it clean in the process. But the money laundering was only the first layer of this toxic financial onion. The tax evasion was staggering. By faking those massive overseas purchases, Donovan and Beatrice artificially inflated their business expenses on their domestic corporate tax returns. They reported millions of dollars in catastrophic operating losses to the Internal Revenue Service. Because they claimed to be losing money hand over fist, they paid absolutely zero federal income tax. Zero. Meanwhile, they were secretly funneling the scrubbed money right back into their personal executive accounts to fund their lavish lifestyle entirely tax-free. I ran the numbers through my auditing software compiling the hidden revenue streams over the past 5 years. The final total made my blood run cold: $15 million. Donovan and his mother had successfully hidden $15 million from the federal government. They were not just cheating on their taxes, they were committing severe federal offenses that carried decades in prison. Then I turned my attention to the personal assets. I needed to see exactly how exposed my children and I were in this mess. I pulled the property records and the title deed for our beautiful $1.5 million Bellevue mansion. What I found made me sick to my stomach. Donovan and Beatrice had not just used the company accounts for their fraud, they had weaponized our family home. The mansion was heavily leveraged. They had used the property as collateral to secure multiple massive commercial bridge loans from private lenders. They needed continuous influxes of clean domestic cash to keep the illusion of their legitimate business afloat while the offshore money was being washed. They were borrowing clean money against the house to fund their illegal operations. They did not own that mansion. The bank owned it. And Donovan had secretly taken out a second mortgage on the property just 3 months ago, forging my signature on the spousal consent forms. My entire life had been a lie built on a foundation of stolen money. The designer clothes, the luxury cars, the private school tuitions for Leo and Sophie. It was all funded by a $15 million federal crime. Donovan and Beatrice were sitting on a ticking time bomb. The Internal Revenue Service has an entire division dedicated to tracking this exact type of offshore evasion. It was only a matter of time before an automated algorithm flagged their suspicious wire transfers, or a bank compliance officer noticed the lack of shipping manifests. When that bomb finally detonated, the federal government would seize everything. They would freeze the bank accounts, confiscate the cars, and take the house. If I stayed and fought a traditional divorce battle, I would be dragging myself right into the blast zone. As his wife, my name was still legally tied to some of those assets. If the authorities raided the house tomorrow, my children would be left homeless, and I could potentially be investigated as an accessory to his financial crimes simply by association. I could lose my certified public accountant license. I could lose my career. I could lose Leo and Sophie. I stared at the screen, the cold light illuminating the cheap motel room. I realized then that exposing them immediately was not the right move. If I blew the whistle right now, Donovan's expensive legal team would drag me down with him. They would claim I was the accountant that I had orchestrated the fraud to enrich myself. I needed a way to completely sever my legal and financial ties to this family before the federal agents kicked down the door. I needed Donovan to take full undeniable responsibility for every single fraudulent document and every stolen dollar. I powered down the new laptop and packed it carefully into my bag. The sun was just beginning to rise over the Seattle skyline. I checked out of the motel and drove to pick up my children from my mother's house. The fear was gone. The shock of the affair was entirely erased. I knew exactly what I was dealing with now, and I knew exactly how to destroy them. But before I could set the trap, I had to play the part of the weak, heartbroken wife. I had to go back to the mansion and face the man who was threatening my entire existence. I drove back to the Bellevue mansion to face the man who was threatening my entire existence. I parked my modest sedan next to Donovan's gleaming sports car in our expansive circular driveway. The rain had finally stopped, but the Seattle sky remained a bruised, heavy gray. I unbuckled Leo and Sophie from the back seat, forcing a bright, cheerful smile onto my face. I told them we were having an indoor movie marathon and sent them straight upstairs to the media room with a massive bowl of popcorn. I needed them securely occupied and completely out of earshot. As their small footsteps faded up the carpeted stairs, the temperature in the grand foyer seemed to plummet. I knew Donovan was waiting for me. I found him in the kitchen. He was leaning casually against the massive marble island holding a crystal glass of expensive bourbon. He had not bothered to change out of his custom Italian suit from the previous day. His eyes were dark and predatory. He did not look like a husband who had been caught cheating in his marital bed. He looked like a cornered snake ready to strike. He took a slow sip of his drink and set it down with a sharp clink against the stone counter. "Where have you been, Madeline?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. I kept my posture rigid, wrapping my arms around my waist to mimic a defensive broken stance. "I needed space," I replied, letting my voice waver just enough to sound vulnerable. "After what I walked in on yesterday, I needed time away from you." Donovan chuckled, a dry, humorless sound that echoed off the stainless steel appliances. He pushed off the counter and took 2 slow, deliberate steps toward me, backing me into the refrigerator. "Space," he repeated, shaking his head slowly. "Is that what you call logging into my home office computer at midnight? Is that what you call a massive data export from the secure family server?" My heart skipped a single terrifying beat. I had been incredibly careful, but his IT monitoring software must have flagged the sheer volume of the download. I immediately dropped my gaze to the floor, perfectly playing the part of the desperate wife caught digging for scraps. "I wanted to see our personal bank accounts," I lied, forcing my voice to crack. "I wanted to know exactly how much money you spent on her. I wanted to see the hotel receipts, the jewelry purchases. I wanted to see what my loyalty was worth to you." Donovan threw his head back and laughed loudly. It was the arrogant laugh of a man who firmly believed he held all the power in the universe. He actually thought I was just a jealous weeping woman looking for credit card charges from fancy restaurants with his 25-year-old mistress. He had absolutely no idea that I had downloaded the digital blueprint to a $15 million federal crime syndicate. He stepped even closer, invading my personal space entirely. The smell of his strong bourbon mixed with the lingering scent of his expensive cologne made my stomach turn. He slammed his hand flat against the refrigerator door, right next to my head, trapping me in place. "You listen to me, you pathetic little bean counter," he snarled, dropping the charming facade completely. "You think you can dig up some credit card statements and squeeze me for a massive divorce settlement? You think you are walking away from this marriage with half of my family's wealth?" I kept my eyes wide, forcing myself to shrink away from him as if I were terrified. "I just want what is fair for me and the kids," I whispered. "Fair." Donovan spat the word out like it was pure poison. "I dictate what is fair. My family built this empire. You were just a temporary guest who overstayed her welcome. You are exactly like your mother, a middle-class government drone who thinks she deserves a piece of the pie she never baked. If you even think about hiring some discount strip mall lawyer to come after my assets, I will absolutely bury you." He leaned in so close I could feel the heat radiating off his skin. His voice dropped to a vicious, venomous whisper. "I have a legal team on retainer that charges more per hour than you make in an entire month. I will drag this divorce out for years until you are bankrupt, broken, and begging me for pennies. And if you try to make this ugly Madeline, I will take Leo and Sophie." The threat hung in the air, heavy and lethal. "I will instruct my lawyers to paint you exactly as you are," Donovan continued ruthlessly. A cold, unstable, overworked woman who severely neglected her family. I will submit your 60-hour work weeks to the judge. I will have a high-priced psychological evaluator declare you an unfit, absent mother. I will take full primary custody, and I will make sure the court orders you to pay me child support just to rub salt in the wound. You do not have the money to fight me. You do not have the power to fight my family. You are nothing. Every single maternal instinct in my body screamed at me to claw his eyes out. The sheer malice of threatening to rip my children away from me simply to protect his fragile ego and his wallet was utterly unforgivable. He was fully willing to traumatize two innocent kids just to avoid paying a dime in alimony. But the forensic accountant inside me remained perfectly, chillingly still. I did not fight back. I did not scream. I forced a single calculated tear to roll down my cheek. "Please, Donovan," I begged, letting my voice sound completely defeated and desperate. "Please do not take my babies. I will not fight you. I will not ask for the house. Just let me keep the kids." Donovan smiled, a cruel, deeply satisfied stretching of his lips. He backed away from me, picking his glass of bourbon back up. "That is what I thought," he said smugly. "You will take exactly what I give you and you will say thank you. Now get out of my sight." I kept my head bowed as I walked past him and hurried up the stairs. Once I was safely inside the guest bedroom with the heavy door locked behind me, I wiped the tear from my cheek. My hands were no longer shaking. My posture straightened. Donovan thought he had just terrified me into total submission. He thought threatening my children was his ultimate trump card. He was completely wrong. That vicious threat was the final nail in his coffin. I was no longer just planning a divorce strategy to escape a cheating husband. I was planning a flawless, absolute execution. The transition from shocked wife to calculated predator required me to maintain the facade of a broken woman for just a little longer. It was agonizing, but it was necessary. The hardest test of my resolve came 2 weeks before the final divorce hearing. Beatrice, in a display of pure, unadulterated cruelty, insisted on hosting a family dinner at our Bellevue mansion. She claimed it was to discuss the transition for the children, but I knew exactly what it really was. It was a power play, a chance for them to humiliate me in my own home one last time. I spent the afternoon cleaning the house, a task Beatrice usually left for the hired help, but today she insisted I do it to prepare for our guests. I scrubbed floors and polished countertops, channeling my simmering rage into physical exertion. When the doorbell rang promptly at 6, I took a deep breath, plastered on a look of defeated resignation, and opened the door. Beatrice swept in first, wearing a tailored silk suit and a cloud of overpowering perfume. Close behind her was Vanessa, Donovan's younger sister, carrying a bottle of expensive wine. Vanessa was 32, a carbon copy of her mother in both appearance and attitude. She had the same sharp features, the same haughty posture, and the same absolute certainty that she was inherently superior to everyone around her. But the real gut punch came a moment later when Donovan walked through the door. His hand was resting firmly on the small of Brittany's back. Brittany, the 25-year-old mistress, smiled sweetly at me as she stepped into the foyer. She was wearing a dress that was entirely inappropriate for a family dinner, and she clutched a designer handbag that I recognized immediately. It was one of the purchases I had found hidden in the offshore accounting files. "Maddie, be a dear and take our coats," Beatrice said casually, handing me her fur wrap without looking at me. "And tell the caterers to hold the appetizers for another 15 minutes. We are expecting Jamal shortly." I took their coats, my jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. This was my house. I was the one who had spent hours choosing the furniture, picking out the paint colors, and making it a home. And now they were treating me like the hired help, while parading the woman who destroyed my marriage right through my front door. We moved into the formal dining room. The caterers had set a beautiful table complete with crystal glasses and fine china. Beatrice directed everyone to their seats, pointedly placing Brittany in the chair right next to Donovan, the seat that had always been mine. I was relegated to the far end of the table next to the kitchen door. Vanessa leaned across the table, her eyes glinting with malice. "So, Maddie," she began, her tone dripping with fake sympathy. How is your mother doing Helen right? Is she still working that dreary little government job? My mother retired from the IRS, I replied quietly, keeping my gaze fixed on my water glass. Vanessa laughed, a sharp, unpleasantly loud sound. Oh, right. The IRS. How incredibly tedious. I cannot imagine spending 30 years crunching numbers for bureaucrats. It must be so depressing to look back on a life of such absolute mediocrity. Well, not everyone is cut out for greatness, Vanessa, Beatrice chimed in, taking a sip of her wine. Some people are just born to be average. It is not their fault they lack ambition. They were talking about my mother, a woman who had dedicated her life to public service, a woman who possessed more intelligence and integrity in her little finger than this entire family combined. But I could not defend her. Not yet. I had to let them think they were winning. Brittany giggled, leaning into Donovan. I am just so glad I found someone who understands ambition, she cooed, tracing a finger along his jawline. Donovan works so hard. He deserves someone who appreciates everything he does for his family. Donovan puffed out his chest, looking immensely pleased with himself. It takes a certain kind of woman to understand the pressures of running a successful empire, he declared. A woman who knows how to support her man, not compete with him. The conversation continued in this vein for the next hour. They discussed their upcoming vacations, their luxury purchases, and their plans for the future. A future that very clearly included Brittany and entirely excluded me. They talked over me, ignored me, and treated me as if I were completely invisible. When the caterers brought out the main course, Beatrice suddenly turned her attention back to me. Maddie, since you are leaving the house anyway, I assume you will not be needing the silver service. It is a family heirloom, you know. I will be taking it back tonight. It was a wedding gift from your parents, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Yes, well, circumstances have changed, Beatrice stated flatly. And frankly, you will not have any use for it in whatever tiny apartment you end up renting. Brittany, on the other hand, will need something proper for when she and Donovan entertain clients. Brittany beamed at Beatrice. Oh, thank you, Mrs. Vance. I promise I will take excellent care of it. The utter shamelessness of it all was suffocating. They were dividing up my life, my belongings, while I sat right there. They were systematically dismantling my existence and replacing me with a younger, more compliant version, all while patting themselves on the back for their generosity. I looked down at my plate, my appetite completely gone. I focused on the intricate pattern of the china, reminding myself of the encrypted hard drive sitting safely in a safety deposit box. I reminded myself of the federal statutes regarding tax evasion and money laundering. I reminded myself that their arrogance was their greatest weakness and I was going to exploit it ruthlessly. Just as Vanessa was launching into another tirade about my mother's lack of class, the front door opened and heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway. Jamal, Vanessa's husband, had finally arrived, and the dynamic in the room was about to shift dramatically. Jamal stepped into the dining room, shaking the cold Seattle rain from his jacket. At 34 years old, Jamal was a brilliant software engineer and a man of uncompromising principle. As an African-American man who had built his entire career on hard work and ethical coding, his quiet, grounded dignity stood in stark contrast to the loud, flashy arrogance of his in-laws. He possessed a deeply ingrained moral compass that frequently put him at odds with the Vance family, though he usually managed to maintain a polite distance. He paused at the threshold of the dining room, his sharp, analytical eyes sweeping over the scene. I watched him process the visual data. He saw me relegated to the far corner near the swinging kitchen door. He saw Beatrice holding court at the head of the table. And then his gaze locked onto Brittany, sitting exactly where I was supposed to be, draped over Donovan's arm and wearing her inappropriately revealing cocktail dress. Sorry I am late, Jamal said, his deep baritone voice instantly commanding the attention of the room. Traffic on the floating bridge was completely backed up. He walked over to Vanessa, kissing the top of her head before taking the empty seat directly across from Donovan. He did not offer a greeting to Brittany. He simply ignored her existence entirely. Vanessa, eager to prove her loyalty to her mother, immediately tried to pull her husband into their cruel game. You missed it, Jamal. We were just discussing how Madeline is going to leave the vintage silver service behind for Brittany. Since Maddie will be downsizing to some cramped little apartment soon, she really has no use for fine dining ware. Jamal froze. His hand reaching for his water glass stopped dead mid-air. He looked at his wife, then at Donovan, and finally at Beatrice. The muscles in his jaw tightened, pulsing with a sudden, barely contained tension. "It is just practical," Beatrice sniffed, cutting into her prime rib with aggressive precision. "Donovan needs a household equipped for entertaining real corporate clients. Brittany is eager to learn how to host properly. Maddie never had the pedigree for it." Donovan smirked, swirling his expensive red wine. "Exactly. A man in my position needs a supportive partner, not a hostile roommate who works overtime for government paychecks." Jamal slowly lowered his hand. He did not pick up his fork. He did not reach for his linen napkin. He simply looked around the table with an expression of absolute, unadulterated disgust. The silence stretched for 3 agonizing seconds. Then, with a sudden and explosive force, Jamal slammed his open palm flat against the heavy mahogany table. The impact was violently loud. The crystal glasses rattled, spilling water onto the pristine white tablecloth. The silverware clattered against the fine china. Brittany let out a high-pitched, startled yelp, clutching Donovan's arm in genuine panic. Everyone froze in shock. Jamal never raised his voice, and he rarely lost his temper. His anger was a cold, terrifyingly quiet force that demanded absolute submission. "I have sat at this table for 5 years." Jamal began, his voice dangerously low, slicing through the heavy, suffocating silence of the dining room. "I have smiled politely through the snide remarks. I have ignored the blatant narcissism. I have tolerated the endless, pathetic boasting about wealth and status. But this is a new low even for you people." Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Jamal, how dare you speak to us this way in our own home?" "This is Maddie's home." Jamal shot back, his dark eyes flashing with righteous, undeniable fury. He pointed directly at Donovan. "You have the audacity to bring your mistress into the house where your children sleep. You parade her around in front of the woman who spent the last decade building a life with you. You sit there demanding her family heirlooms so you can play house with a girl who barely looks old enough to rent a car. You are not a man, Donovan. You are a coward, a weak, insecure boy who needs to tear down a brilliant woman just to make yourself feel tall." Donovan's face turned a violent shade of crimson. He gripped the edge of the table, half standing. "Watch your mouth, Jamal. You do not disrespect me at my own dinner table." "Respect is earned," Jamal fired back instantly, not backing down an inch. "And you have done absolutely nothing to earn it. You are a fraud." Vanessa grabbed Jamal's arm, her face pale with embarrassment and fear. "Jamal, stop it right now. You are embarrassing me in front of my family." Jamal pulled his arm away from his wife with a sharp jerk. He looked at her with a profound, devastating disappointment that made Vanessa physically shrink back into her chair. "No, Vanessa, you are embarrassing yourself. I just watched you sit here and ruthlessly mock Maddie's mother, a woman who served her country with honor and actually worked for a living while you have never worked a hard day in your entire life. You are acting exactly like your mother, and it is entirely repulsive." Beatrice looked like she might actually faint. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The pristine illusion of her high society dinner party was being violently dismantled by the only person in the room with an actual moral compass. Brittany tried to slide lower in her chair, suddenly realizing that marrying into this family was not the glamorous, easy prize she thought she had won. Jamal pushed his chair back and stood up to his full, imposing height. He looked down at the Vance family with nothing but pure pity. Then he turned his gaze entirely away from them and looked directly at me. The fierce anger drained from his face, replaced immediately by genuine sorrow and profound respect. "Maddie?" Jamal said, his voice softening completely. "I am so incredibly sorry. I am sorry for what they are doing to you. I am sorry you have to endure this toxicity for even 1 more minute. You are worth 10 of Donovan. You are incredibly smart, you are capable, and you are an amazing mother to Leo and Sophie. Do not let these miserable, hollow people convince you otherwise for a single second. You are going to survive this, and you are going to leave them in the dust. I looked at Jamal, my eyes wide with surprise and immense gratitude. For months, I had felt completely isolated, surrounded by Donovan's enablers and Beatrice's clones. I had been gaslit into wondering if I was the crazy one. To hear someone validate my sanity, to hear someone speak the absolute truth out loud in this house of lies, was a lifeline I desperately needed. I gave him a small, firm nod of gratitude. Jamal turned back to his wife one last time. "I'm going home, Vanessa. If you want to stay here and celebrate this disgusting display of cruelty, that is your choice, but I will not be a part of it." Without waiting for a response, Jamal tossed his linen napkin onto his untouched plate. He turned his back on the wealthiest, most arrogant family in Bellevue and strode out of the dining room with absolute dignity. The heavy front door slammed shut a moment later, the sound vibrating through the floorboards. The silence he left behind was absolute and suffocating. Donovan stared at his wineglass, a vein ticking furiously in his jaw. Beatrice was taking short, shallow breaths, fanning herself with her napkin. Vanessa looked panicked, her eyes darting between the front door and her mother, torn between running after her husband and staying to maintain the family facade. In that perfectly shattered silence, I picked up my water glass and took a slow, calm sip. Jamal had just proven my most important theory. This family was entirely dependent on the illusion of their own superiority. When forced to look in the mirror when confronted with the actual undeniable truth of their moral bankruptcy, they had absolutely no defense. They were weak, fragile, and utterly predictable. I set my glass down, a new dangerous fire igniting in my chest. If Jamal could see right through them, the federal government would have a field day tearing their lives apart. I did not say a word to the stunned people sitting around the table. I simply stood up, pushed my chair in, and walked out the back door into the cool night air. It was time to leave this dinner from hell. It was time to call my mother and set the trap. I drove away from the Bellevue mansion with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The rain was coming down in sheets, blurring the streetlights into abstract streaks of neon. My mind was racing, trying to process the sheer audacity of what had just happened. Jamal's stand had been spectacular, but it had also painted a massive target on my back. Donovan and Beatrice would not let that humiliation go unanswered. They would retaliate, and they would aim for the one thing I valued more than my own life, my children. I pulled into the quiet, unassuming driveway of my mother's modest ranch-style home in West Seattle. The porch light was on a steady, welcoming beacon in the darkness. I grabbed the encrypted hard drive from my purse and hurried up the walkway. Helen opened the door before I even knocked. She was wearing her comfortable fleece robe, a cup of herbal tea in her hand. She took one look at my face and set the mug down on the entryway table. "They finally pushed too far," Helen stated. It was not a question. I stepped inside, closing the door firmly behind me. The warmth of the house, the familiar scent of cinnamon and old books, suddenly broke through the icy armor I had built around myself. I collapsed into my mother's arms, the tears I had refused to shed in front of Donovan and Beatrice finally spilling over. I cried for the betrayal, for the loss of the life I thought I had built, and for the terror of the impending battle. Helen held me tight, stroking my hair, letting me release the pressure valve. "Let it out, Maddie. Cry now, because after tonight, we do not shed another tear for that family." After a few minutes, I pulled back, wiping my face with the back of my hand. I took a deep breath, feeling the forensic accountant reemerge cold and calculating. "I need your help, Mom," I said, my voice steadying. "I need your expertise." I pulled the encrypted hard drive from my purse and held it up. "I went into Donovan's home office a few nights ago. I copied the master directory from the family business server." Helen's eyebrows shot up. Her 30 years as a senior investigator for the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division instantly kicked in. The warm, comforting mother vanished, replaced by a sharp, analytical federal agent. "Are you telling me you have unauthorized access to their corporate financial records?" Helen asked, her tone shifting to professional urgency. "It wasn't unauthorized," I clarified. "I helped him set up the software years ago, and my access was never revoked. It is a shared marital server." Helen nodded, her expression grim. Show me. We moved to her small home office. I booted up her secure desktop, plugged in the drive, and entered the decryption key. The files loaded, displaying the labyrinth of spreadsheets, invoices, and offshore account data. Look at the vendor payouts, I instructed, pointing to the screen. They are funneling millions to logistics companies in the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas. Helen leaned in close, her eyes darting across the numbers. No shipping manifests, no customs declarations. These are shell companies. Exactly, I said. And look at the domestic operating losses. They are writing off the fake expenses to zero out their federal tax liability. Helen clicked through the tax returns, her face hardening into a mask of pure disgust. This is a classic placement and layering scheme. They are washing dirty money through offshore accounts and bringing it back as foreign capital investments or consulting fees. There is more, I said, pulling up the property records. They leveraged the Bellevue mansion to secure commercial bridge loans. They needed clean domestic cash to keep the legitimate front operating while the dirty money was being washed. Donovan forged my signature on the spousal consent forms for a second mortgage 3 months ago. Helen sat back in her chair, exhaling a long, slow breath. Maddie, this isn't just a messy divorce. This is a massive federal crime syndicate. We are looking at $15 million in tax evasion, wire fraud, and money laundering. I know, I replied. And if I stay and fight a traditional divorce, they will drag me down with them. If the feds raid that house, my name is still on those assets. I could lose my CPA license. I could be investigated as an accessory. Helen stood up, pacing the small room. Her mind was working furiously, analyzing the legal statutes, the potential charges, and the strategies for immunity. Donovan threatened me. I continued the memory of his vicious ultimatum, fueling my resolve. He said he would use his expensive legal team to paint me as an unfit mother. He threatened to take full primary custody of Leo and Sophie just to avoid paying child support. Helen stopped pacing and turned to face me. The look in her eyes was terrifyingly cold. He threatened my grandchildren, yes. Then we destroy him, Helen stated with absolute certainty. We do not just leave him penniless. We ensure he spends the next 2 decades in federal prison. I nodded, the plan forming rapidly in my mind. I need to completely sever my legal and financial ties to him and the business before the IRS algorithms flag the offshore transfers. I need him to take full, undeniable responsibility for every single fraudulent document and every stolen dollar. We need a legally flawless execution, Helen agreed. A bloodless trap that he walks into, willingly blinded by his own arrogance. We spent the next 6 hours meticulously dissecting the financial data, Helen, drawing on her extensive experience prosecuting high-level white-collar criminals, outlined the exact legal mechanisms we needed to deploy. We discussed indemnification clauses, asset transfer agreements, and the critical importance of plausible deniability. Donovan is a narcissist, Helen observed, pouring us both another cup of strong coffee. He believes he is untouchable. He believes you are weak and desperate. We are going to use that arrogance against him. How? I asked, leaning over the desk. We give him exactly what he wants, Helen said, a predatory smile touching her lips. We offer him the mansion, the company, and even temporary primary custody. We make the surrender look absolute. But I cannot give up my kids, Mom. I cannot let him take them. You won't, Helen assured me. The custody arrangement will be temporary. The moment a federal indictment is unsealed against him, the family court will grant an emergency ex parte order giving you sole legal and physical custody. A judge will never leave children with a man facing 20 years for money laundering. The logic was brutal but undeniable. It was a calculated risk, but it was the only way to ensure their safety and my complete exoneration. We need to draft a specific addendum to the divorce settlement, Helen instructed. An indemnification clause so watertight that no defense attorney can crack it. It must explicitly state that by accepting the assets, Donovan assumes 100% of all civil, criminal, and federal tax liabilities associated with them. He will never sign that if he reads it, I pointed out. He won't read it, Helen said with chilling confidence. He is too cheap to pay his lawyers to review last-minute addendums, and he is too arrogant to believe you could outsmart him. We bury it at the very bottom of a 300-page document. We let his greed blind him. I looked at the screen, the evidence of Donovan's impending destruction glowing in the dim light. The forensic accountant had awakened, guided by the seasoned expertise of a federal investigator. We had our strategy, we had our weapon. It was time to draft the trap. The very next morning, I walked into the downtown Seattle office of my family law attorney, Elias. Elias was a sharp, pragmatic man in his late 40s who had spent his entire career navigating the ugly trenches of high-net-worth divorces. He was used to spouses fighting tooth and nail over every single penny, every piece of art, and every real estate property. He was entirely unprepared for a client walking into his office and demanding to surrender her entire marital estate without a fight. I sat across from his heavy glass desk and handed him a printed summary of my demands. Give Donovan the Bellevue Mansion. Give Donovan full ownership of the import-export company. Allow Donovan temporary primary physical custody of Leo and Sophie. Elias stared at the paper, then took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He told me I was making a catastrophic mistake. He reminded me that I was legally entitled to half of the marital assets and that giving up primary custody of my children was something I would regret for the rest of my life. He pleaded with me to let him do his job and fight for my fair share. I waited for him to finish his professional warning, then I leaned forward and slid a second, much thinner folder across the desk. I told him he was looking at the situation like a divorce lawyer, but I needed him to look at it like a criminal defense attorney. I explained the offshore accounts. I explained the phantom shipping manifests. I laid out the multi-million-dollar federal tax evasion scheme and the money laundering operation running directly through the family business and the very mansion he wanted me to fight for. Elias read through my forensic summary. The color slowly drained from his face. He realized instantly that the assets he was supposed to fight for were actually federal evidence. If I fought for the company, I would be fighting for a share of an active criminal enterprise. If I fought for the house, I would be fighting for a property purchased with laundered money, a property that was guaranteed to be seized by the federal government under civil asset forfeiture laws. I was standing in the middle of a legal minefield, and fighting Donovan for half of it would only ensure I was blown to pieces right alongside him. I told Elias that we were going to build a bomb shelter out of paperwork. We needed to draft a specific impenetrable legal addendum. We were going to call it Appendix 4B. We spent the next 4 hours drafting the exact language. The wording had to be absolutely flawless. It could not simply state that I was giving up my shares. It had to explicitly bind Donovan to every single consequence of his own greed. We crafted a comprehensive indemnification and hold harmless clause. It stated that in exchange for receiving 100% of the equity in the business and the real property, Donovan knowingly and willingly assumed 100% of all associated liabilities. I made sure Elias included the exact terminology needed to shield me from the Internal Revenue Service and the Department of Justice. The clause explicitly covered all past, present, and future debts. We listed civil penalties, criminal restitution, federal and state tax liabilities, unpaid corporate taxes, and any fines resulting from federal audits or investigations. We added a specific line stating that Donovan assumed sole responsibility for any discrepancies in the corporate ledgers dating back to the inception of the business. By signing his name, Donovan would legally declare that I had no operational knowledge or financial responsibility for any misdeeds committed by the company. He would be legally volunteering to take the fall for everything, but having the perfect clause was only half the battle. The real intellectual challenge was making sure Donovan actually signed it. Elias and I strategized on the camouflage. We knew Donovan and his aggressive legal team would scrutinize the primary settlement agreement. They would look closely at the division of assets, the custody arrangement, and the lack of alimony. So we gave them exactly what they wanted to see on the first 20 pages. We made the victory look absolute and total. We fed his massive ego. Then we bloated the rest of the document. Elias added hundreds of pages of standard mind-numbing boilerplate language. We included exhaustive definitions of property lines, standard clauses on dispute resolution, endless paragraphs on property maintenance, and pages of repetitive legal jargon designed to induce absolute fatigue in anyone reading it. We referenced Appendix 4B in the main text, using the most boring, innocuous phrasing possible. We called it a standard assumption of liabilities addendum, something routinely included in any corporate transfer to wrap up outstanding vendor bills. We buried Appendix 4B at the very bottom of the 300-page stack, right before the final signature page. We knew Donovan, and we knew his mother Beatrice. They were arrogant, impatient, and incredibly cheap when it came to paying their legal team for extra billable hours. If we sent this massive document over at the 11th hour, right before the final court hearing, they would focus entirely on their massive financial win. They would see that I was surrendering the mansion and the company, and they would rush to sign it before I could change my mind. They would never pay their lawyer to read 300 pages of boilerplate text. They would assume I was just a defeated, broken woman giving up. When Elias finally sent the document to the printer, the machine hummed for a full 10 minutes. The final product landed on his desk with a heavy, satisfying thud. It was a masterpiece of legal warfare. It was a Trojan horse constructed entirely out of legalese and formatted to exploit the sheer laziness of an arrogant narcissist. I ran my fingers over the thick stack of paper, feeling the profound weight of what we had just created. This document was the exact mechanism that would strip Donovan of his freedom and his wealth. This was not a surrender. This was a targeted lethal strike disguised as a white flag. The trap was fully constructed, loaded, and ready to be deployed. Now I just had to make sure my children were safely out of the blast radius. The trap was fully constructed, loaded, and ready to be deployed. Now I just had to make sure my children were safely out of the blast radius. Once the federal authorities received my anonymous tip, which I had meticulously prepared with irrefutable documentation from the encrypted hard drive, the wheels of justice would turn rapidly. An investigation of this magnitude, involving a $15 million money laundering syndicate, would not end with a polite phone call. It would end with black SUVs, armed agents, and a very public, very humiliating raid on the Bellevue mansion. I could not under any circumstances allow Leo and Sophie to witness their father being frog-marched out of their home in handcuffs. The trauma of that image would scar them for life. I needed to get them out of Seattle, and I needed Donovan to think it was his brilliant idea. I waited until a Saturday afternoon when I knew Donovan would be at the country club entertaining clients, or more likely entertaining Brittany. I called his cell phone. He answered on the fourth ring, his tone immediately defensive. "What do you want, Madeline?" he sighed loudly. "I'm busy." "I know, Donovan. I won't take much of your time," I said, pitching my voice to sound tired, overwhelmed, and completely defeated. It was a role I was perfecting. "I'm calling about the children, about summer plans." "Summer plans," he scoffed. "If you think I'm paying for some overpriced daycare so you can focus on your pathetic career, you're out of your mind." "No, that's not it," I replied, forcing a note of hesitation. "I was actually looking into local community center day camps. They're very affordable, but, well, Leo overheard some boys talking about Camp Thunderbird." Camp Thunderbird was an incredibly prestigious, absurdly expensive month-long sleepaway camp in the mountains of Oregon. It was the kind of place where tech billionaires and professional athletes sent their kids to ride horses, build robots, and learn archery. It cost more for a 4-week session than my first car. "Camp Thunderbird," Donovan laughed. "You can't afford Camp Thunderbird on a government auditor's salary. You couldn't even afford the deposit." "I know," I admitted softly. I told Leo it was out of the question. I told him his father and I were going through a difficult financial transition and we just couldn't manage it. He was disappointed, but he understands we have to tighten our belts. The silence on the line stretched for a long moment. I could almost hear the gears grinding in Donovan's narcissistic brain. I had just handed him a scenario where I was the poor failing mother, denying her son a dream experience, and he had the opportunity to swoop in as the wealthy, magnanimous savior. "You told my son we are in a difficult financial transition." Donovan's voice dropped, vibrating with insulted pride. "Do not ever project your financial incompetence onto me, Madeline. I am not tightening any belts. My business is thriving. I am thriving. I didn't mean to imply you couldn't afford it. I backpedaled quickly, laying the trap. It's just, considering the divorce and everything, I didn't want to ask you for such a massive expense. You don't ask me for anything, he snapped. I make the decisions. If my son wants to go to Camp Thunderbird, he goes to Camp Thunderbird. I will not have him slumming it at some community center daycare because his mother is a failure. Donovan, please, I pleaded, ensuring my voice trembled just right. It's too much. It's a full month away. Sophie is only 6, she might get homesick, and I can't pay for even half of it. You won't pay a dime, he declared triumphantly. I will handle the entire tuition for both of them. It will be good for them to get away from your depressing influence for a month. They need to be around success, not mediocrity. I'll have my assistant handle the enrollment and the travel arrangements. They leave the week after school ends. But I started knowing I had to offer token resistance to sell the performance. This is not a negotiation, he cut me off. I am their father, and I provide for my children. You just make sure their bags are packed. He hung up the phone. I sat in my quiet apartment, staring at the blank screen of my phone. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It was almost too easy. His ego was so fragile, his need to appear superior so overwhelming, that he had just willingly financed his children's safe evacuation from a federal crime scene. He wanted to be the hero who sent his kids to the elite summer camp while their mother struggled. He wanted the bragging rights at the country club. He wanted to look like the perfect, generous father. He had absolutely no idea that he had just signed the permission slip for his own downfall. The next few weeks were a masterclass in compartmentalization. I maintained my demanding schedule at the auditing firm during the day, maintaining my reputation as the diligent, focused professional. In the evenings, I finalized the complex legal maneuvers with Elias, ensuring every comma and loophole in the divorce settlement was perfectly aligned to detonate upon impact. And on the weekends, I helped Leo and Sophie pack their trunks for Camp Thunderbird. I bought them new hiking boots, countless pairs of socks, and special stationery so they could write me letters. I hid my intense, desperate need to protect them behind the cheerful facade of an excited mother sending her kids on a grand adventure. On the morning of their departure, I drove them to the designated meeting spot, a luxury charter bus depot in downtown Seattle. Donovan, of course, did not show up. He had sent his personal assistant to oversee their boarding, a final dismissive gesture that only confirmed his profound lack of actual parental interest. I hugged Leo tight, inhaling the scent of his boyish shampoo. Have the best time, buddy. Ride all the horses and eat all the s'mores. I will, Mom! He beamed, practically vibrating with excitement. I knelt down to hug Sophie, pressing a kiss to her cheek. Be brave, my sweet girl. You're going to make so many new friends. I love you, Mommy, she whispered, squeezing my neck. I love you more than anything in this entire world. I whispered back, my voice thick with emotion that was entirely real. I watched the bus pull away, waving until it disappeared into the Seattle traffic. A profound sense of relief washed over me. They were safe. They were surrounded by counselors, nature, and other children. They were miles away from the toxicity of the Vance family and completely insulated from the impending chaos. My children were secure. Now it was time to warn the only innocent person left in the crossfire. It was time to talk to Jamal. My children were secure. Now it was time to warn the only innocent person left in the crossfire. It was time to talk to Jamal. I chose a small, independent coffee shop tucked away in an industrial park in the Fremont neighborhood. It was the kind of place that served pour-over coffee on reclaimed wood tables, miles away from the polished high-end cafes in Bellevue where Beatrice and Vanessa spent their afternoons. There was zero chance anyone from the Vance family would ever set foot in here. I arrived 10 minutes early and claimed a booth in the back corner facing the door. Jamal walked in right on time. He wore a simple gray hooded sweatshirt and dark jeans, shedding the rain from his broad shoulders as he stepped out of the Seattle drizzle. Even in casual clothes, he carried that same quiet, undeniable dignity that had silenced Donovan and Beatrice at the dinner table weeks ago. He spotted me, gave a brief nod, and made his way over with 2 cups of black coffee. He slid one across the table to me and sat down. For a moment, neither of us spoke. There was a mutual understanding in the air, a shared exhaustion from dealing with a family that fed on drama and manipulation. "Thank you for coming, Jamal," I said, keeping my voice low. "You said it was urgent," he replied, taking a sip of his coffee. His dark eyes studied my face carefully. "You look different, Maddie. Tired, but different. Like you are carrying a loaded weapon." He was incredibly perceptive. As a senior software engineer, his entire career was built on identifying patterns and anticipating system failures. He could see the shift in my demeanor. "I want to thank you for what you did at that dinner," I told him, looking directly into his eyes. "You were the only person in that house who treated me like a human being. You stood up to them when it would have been much easier to just keep your head down. I will never forget that." Jamal shook his head, his jaw tightening slightly. "You do not need to thank me for demonstrating basic human decency. What they were doing to you was repulsive. I should have spoken up long before that night. Vanessa has been sliding deeper into her mother's shadow for years, and I kept making excuses for her. But watching them parade Donovan's mistress in front of you while demanding your family heirlooms was my breaking point. I told Vanessa we are doing intensive counseling or I am walking away." I took a deep breath. This was the moment. I had to deliver the message without violating my own legal protection or tipping him off to the federal raid. "Jamal, I asked you here because I respect you." I began, leaning closer across the small table. "You are an honest man who works hard for a living. You built your career on your own merit. I need you to listen to me very carefully, and I need you to trust me without asking too many questions." His posture shifted immediately. The casual coffee shop demeanor vanished, replaced by sharp, focused attention. "I am listening. You need to separate your finances from Vanessa immediately," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I mean today. Whatever joint accounts you share, you need to calculate exactly what you earned from your tech salary and move it into an account with only your name on it. If your name is attached to any Vance family business accounts, any real estate deeds, or any joint investments with Beatrice or Donovan, you need to sever those ties legally and formally by the end of this week." Jamal stared at me. He did not interrupt, but I could see the analytical gears turning in his head. He was processing the variables. "Maddie, what did you find?" He asked, his voice steady but laced with a new underlying tension. "I cannot tell you the details," I replied, maintaining absolute eye contact. "If I tell you, I make you an accessory and I cannot put you in that position. But you know what I do for a living. You know I am a forensic accountant. I look at numbers and I follow the money." Jamal closed his eyes for a brief second and exhaled a long, heavy breath. He was smart enough to put the pieces together. He knew Donovan was flashy and arrogant. He knew Beatrice spent money like it was printed in her basement. And he knew their family import-export business never actually seemed to import or export anything tangible. "Is it bad?" Jamal asked, opening his eyes to look at me again. "It is catastrophic," I answered honestly. "It is a house of cards, Jamal, and someone just lit a match. When it burns down, the blast radius is going to take out anyone whose name is even tangentially connected to their assets. I am telling you this because you are a good father to your kids, and you are a good man. Do not let Vanessa drag you down with her, because when the music stops, Beatrice and Donovan will absolutely throw anyone they can under the bus to save themselves." Jamal absorbed the warning. He did not panic. He did not demand proof. He simply looked at me with profound, somber gratitude. "Vanessa has been asking me to co-sign a new commercial loan for one of Donovan's warehouse expansions." Jamal revealed, his voice remarkably calm, given the circumstances. "She said they just needed a quick cash bridge and my credit score would guarantee a lower interest rate." A cold chill ran down my spine. They were already trying to use him. They were trying to leverage his pristine credit history to float their money laundering operation. "Do not sign a single piece of paper," I warned him fiercely. "In fact, I highly recommend you retain a very good lawyer today, someone who specializes in asset protection. Tell them you are anticipating a high-conflict separation and you need to build a firewall around your personal earnings." Jamal nodded slowly. He picked up his coffee cup, taking a long drink. When he set it down, the decision was firmly made. I will go to the bank on my lunch break, he said. I will move my salary into a separate account, and I will call a lawyer this afternoon. Thank you, Maddie. You do not owe me any thanks, I said, offering him a small, genuine smile. Consider it a return favor for the dinner. We stood up from the booth. Jamal pulled on his jacket, looking out the window at the gray Seattle sky. He looked like a man who had just been told an unavoidable storm was coming, but at least now he had the chance to board up his windows. Take care of yourself, Maddie, Jamal said, offering his hand. I shook it firmly. You too, Jamal. Protect yourself. I watched him walk out of the coffee shop, a tall, principled man striding purposefully into the rain to shield his own life from the impending wreckage. I took a deep breath of the roasting coffee beans and felt a tremendous weight lift off my shoulders. I had protected my children. I had warned the only decent person caught in the crossfire. My conscience was completely clear. There was absolutely nothing left to do but finalize the divorce and let the Vance family walk blindly into the execution chamber they had built for themselves. There was absolutely nothing left to do but finalize the divorce and let the Vance family walk blindly into the execution chamber they had built for themselves. The final week before the court date was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Donovan and his highly paid legal team decided to employ a classic intimidation tactic. They sent over a settlement agreement that was so massive, it arrived at my lawyer's office in two separate heavy-duty binder boxes. It was 300 pages of dense, suffocating legal jargon. Elias dropped the boxes onto his conference table with a heavy thud. He told me it was the most aggressively drafted divorce decree he had ever seen in his entire career. Donovan wanted everything. He demanded the Bellevue mansion, the import-export business, the luxury vehicles, and temporary primary physical custody of Leo and Sophie. He even included a petty vindictive clause demanding I return the vintage silver service his mother had gifted us for our wedding. The document was explicitly designed to overwhelm me. It was meant to make me feel so small and financially outgunned that I would simply surrender out of pure exhaustion. I looked at the towering stack of paper and felt a profound sense of satisfaction. Arrogance always leaves a blind spot. Donovan was trying to drown me in paperwork, completely unaware that he was providing the absolute perfect camouflage for my trap. I told Elias to accept every single demand on pages 1 through 290. I told him to let Donovan feel like an absolute conqueror. We needed him to revel in his perceived victory. Then we went to work on the final 10 pages. Elias drafted a response that appeared to be a standard, mind-numbingly boring administrative addendum. We titled it Appendix 4B. On the surface, it looked like a routine transfer of utility accounts, property maintenance schedules, and final vendor billing agreements. We used the exact same font, the exact same margin width, and the exact same dry legal formatting as the rest of Donovan's bloated document. But buried deep inside paragraph 7 of Appendix 4B was the lethal injection. It was the indemnification clause my mother Helen and I had designed. It stated in clear, undeniable legal terms that by accepting sole ownership of the marital assets, the petitioner willingly and knowingly assumed 100% of all past, present, and future liabilities. I insisted Elias include specific language about international wire transfers, commercial bridge loans, and corporate tax filings. The clause legally bound Donovan to every single fraudulent invoice and every laundered dollar sitting in those offshore accounts. By signing it, he was legally confessing to the entire $15 million fraud and shielding me completely from the federal government. Timing, the delivery was absolutely critical. Elias and I waited until exactly 4:55 on a Friday afternoon to email the revised document back to Donovan's legal team. The final court hearing was scheduled for Monday morning. We knew exactly how this would play out. Corporate lawyers check out mentally on Friday evenings. And more importantly, arrogant wealthy clients like Donovan absolutely hate paying for weekend billable hours. Less than an hour later, my phone vibrated with an incoming text from Donovan. He was furious that Elias had attached an addendum, viewing it as a pathetic last-minute attempt by a desperate woman to cling to his wealth. He sent me a voice message that I saved directly to my secure cloud drive. His tone was dripping with absolute contempt. He told me he was tired of my games. He bragged about how much his lead attorney charged per hour and explicitly stated he was not going to authorize a single cent more to review my petty demands. He said he knew I was just trying to negotiate for the dining room furniture or some other worthless middle-class sentimental garbage. He said his mother was already planning a massive victory party at the mansion, and he would not let my pathetic paperwork delay the caterers. He ordered me to show up at court on Monday morning and sign the papers, promising that if I delayed the proceedings by one more minute, he would ruin me entirely. Through the tight-knit legal grapevine, Elias later confirmed exactly what happened in the opposing counsel's office. Donovan's lawyer had flagged the new addendum and requested authorization to spend 2 hours reviewing the changes over the weekend. Beatrice, who aggressively controlled the purse strings for Donovan's legal defense fund, threw a massive fit. She screamed at the lawyer over the phone, complaining about his exorbitant fees. She flatly refused to pay him $1,000 an hour to read a document drafted by my discount attorney. She instructed the lawyer to simply print the final signature pages and bring them to court. They were so blinded by their greed and their intense hatred for me that they slammed the door on their only chance of survival. On Sunday evening, Elias forwarded me an email from Donovan's lead counsel. The message was short and highly unprofessional. It stated that the client formally declined to review the minor administrative addendums and demanded we proceed to immediate signatures on Monday morning. I sat at the small kitchen table in my rented apartment staring at that email. A cold, electric thrill rushed through my veins. The trap was locked. The steel jaws had clamped down, and the prey had absolutely no idea they were already caught. Donovan and Beatrice thought they were saving a few $1,000s in legal fees. They thought they had outsmarted the quiet, boring auditor. They were about to learn the most devastating lesson of their entire lives. I stood up and walked over to my closet. I reached past the few colorful dresses I owned and pulled out a simple, unassuming gray blazer. It was the exact kind of outfit Beatrice loved to mock. It was the uniform of a working-class woman. I hung it on the door, ready for the morning. I was going to walk into that courtroom looking completely defeated. I was going to let them laugh. I was going to let them gloat. Because I knew the moment my pen touched that paper, the Vance family empire would instantly turn to dust. The elevator descended with a smooth, silent glide, carrying my mother and me away from the floor where my marriage had officially ended. The doors opened to the bustling main lobby of the King County Family Court. Lawyers rushed past with briefcases, couples stood in tense huddles, and the sheer volume of human conflict echoed off the marble walls. I stepped out into the damp Seattle morning, the cold air hitting my face like a refreshing wake-up call. The sky was still heavy with clouds, but for the first time in months, I felt an undeniable lightness in my chest. Helen walked beside me, her posture impeccably straight. She did not speak until we were safely inside my modest rented sedan parked 3 blocks away from the courthouse. The moment the doors locked, she turned to me. "They bought it," Helen said, her voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial murmur. "Every single piece of it." "They were too busy planning their victory party to read the fine print," I replied, starting the engine. "Donovan practically broke his wrist signing those papers." We drove in comfortable silence toward the small 2-bedroom apartment I had rented in a quiet, unassuming neighborhood. It was a stark contrast to the sprawling Bellevue mansion. The walls were thin, the appliances were outdated, and the view from the window was simply a brick wall. But it was mine. And more importantly, it was completely disconnected from the $15 million federal fraud operation that was about to explode. I parked the car and we walked up the 2 flights of stairs to my apartment. The space was tidy and functional, devoid of the excessive luxury that Beatrice so highly valued. I walked straight to the small desk in the corner of the living room and opened my laptop. The encrypted hard drive containing the master directory of the Vance family's illegal financial network was already plugged in and waiting. I opened my secure, encrypted email client. During her 30 years at the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division, my mother had cultivated a network of highly competent, ruthlessly efficient federal agents. One of those agents was a man named Special Agent Harris. He specialized in international money laundering and corporate tax evasion. He was the kind of investigator who lived for the thrill of dismantling complex financial syndicates. Helen had already briefed him on the broad strokes of the situation, securing his absolute attention without violating any confidentiality agreements. I drafted a brief, highly professional email addressed directly to Special Agent Harris. I did not include any emotional pleas or personal grievances. I simply outlined the facts. I attached the complete decrypted master directory containing the offshore vendor invoices, the dual corporate ledgers, and the records of the fraudulent commercial bridge loans secured against the Bellevue mansion. Then I attached the final piece of the puzzle. I scanned the fully executed judge-approved divorce decree. I made sure Appendix 4B was perfectly legible. The indemnification clause bearing Donovan's arrogant scrawled signature clearly outlined his voluntary assumption of 100% of all civil, criminal, and federal tax liabilities associated with the business and the property. I reviewed the email one last time. The subject line was stark and clinical. Vance Import-Export, evidence of federal tax evasion and money laundering. I hovered my cursor over the send button. This single click would set off a chain reaction that would completely eradicate the Vance family empire. It would strip Donovan of his unearned wealth, his undeserved freedom, and his fragile ego. It would tear Beatrice from her high society pedestal and expose her as the manipulative criminal she truly was. It would dismantle their entire existence with the ruthless, undeniable precision of federal law. "Do it, Maddie," Helen said softly, standing behind my chair. They made their choices. Now they face the consequences. I clicked send. The progress bar zipped across the screen and a small notification chimed, confirming the secure delivery. The evidence was now in the hands of the federal government. The trap was sprung. The countdown had officially begun. I leaned back in the chair, exhaling a breath I felt like I had been holding for months. The overwhelming anxiety, the constant fear of Donovan's threats, the suffocating presence of Beatrice's cruelty, it all evaporated, replaced by a profound, icy calm. "How long will it take?" I asked, looking up at my mother. "Harris is relentless," Helen replied, pouring us both a glass of water from the kitchen sink. "Given the sheer volume of evidence and the clear, undeniable proof of offshore money laundering, he will fast-track this. He will secure the federal warrants by tomorrow morning. The raid will happen before the week is over. They will hit the corporate offices and the mansion simultaneously to prevent any destruction of evidence." I nodded, my mind immediately shifting to logistics. Leo and Sophie were already safely ensconced at Camp Thunderbird in Oregon. Jamal had successfully separated his finances and retained Asset Protection Counsel. I was legally and financially insulated from the impending blast radius. Everything was perfectly aligned. "They are throwing a divorce party this weekend," I said, remembering Donovan's arrogant voice message. "Beatrice is likely hiring caterers right now." Helen smiled, a sharp, predatory expression that perfectly mirrored my own internal satisfaction. "Then we let them party. We let them celebrate their massive victory. They deserve one last weekend of luxury before they trade their tailored suits for federal jumpsuits." I spent the rest of the day finalizing the setup of my new life. I organized the small bedroom for Leo and Sophie, setting up their favorite books and toys so the space would feel familiar when they eventually returned. I reviewed my finances, calculating my solid, honest salary as a forensic accountant. It was not mansion money, but it was clean, and it was enough to provide a stable, loving home for my children. That evening, I stood by the small window in my apartment, looking out at the brick wall. I thought about Donovan and Beatrice in their sprawling mansion, drinking expensive champagne, laughing about how they had ruined me. They believed they were untouchable. They believed their wealth and arrogance shielded them from consequences. They had absolutely no idea that the silent, boring auditor they had so ruthlessly discarded had just authored their complete destruction. I turned away from the window, a genuine sense of peace settling over me. The storm was coming, and I was safely watching from the shore. 3 days later, the Bellevue mansion was practically vibrating with the thumping bass of a live DJ. Donovan and Beatrice were not just celebrating a divorce. They were hosting a coronation. They had invited over 100 guests, a curated list of their wealthiest, most superficial acquaintances, business partners who benefited from their success, and anyone who had ever looked down their nose at my middle-class background. Caterers in crisp white uniforms circulated with silver trays of caviar and vintage champagne. The entire house was flooded with harsh, glaring light illuminating the sheer, overwhelming arrogance of the Vance family. Donovan stood by the massive marble kitchen island, holding a freshly poured glass of scotch. He was wearing a velvet smoking jacket that looked ridiculous, but he carried it with the absolute certainty of a man who believed he had just conquered the world. Brittany was clinging to his arm wearing a diamond tennis bracelet that I immediately recognized. It was the same bracelet I had seen logged in the offshore corporate expense files purchased with laundered money just 2 months prior. She laughed loudly, tossing her hair back and pressing herself against him, performing the role of the devoted, adoring new partner for everyone to see. Beatrice was in her element. She glided through the great room, her heavy fur coat discarded for an equally gaudy sequined gown. She stopped at every group of guests, making sure they all heard her carefully constructed version of the divorce. "It is just such a relief," I heard Beatrice say to a group of heavily Botoxed women holding martini glasses. "We finally excised that tedious little auditor from our lives. She was completely draining Donovan's spirit. You know she actually tried to fight us for the house. Can you imagine a woman who buys her clothes off the rack demanding a piece of this estate? It was pathetic." The women nodded sympathetically, murmuring their agreement and sipping their drinks. Beatrice smiled, a sharp, cruel expression that stretched her tight skin. "Donovan's legal team crushed her, of course." Beatrice continued, her voice carrying over the music. "She signed away everything. The house, the company, even the primary custody arrangement. She walked out of that courthouse with absolutely nothing but the ugly gray blazer on her back. It is exactly what she deserves for trying to steal from a family of our stature." Donovan caught his mother's eye across the room and raised his glass in a silent toast. He then turned his attention back to his own circle of sycophants. "The best part," Donovan boasted loudly, making sure the surrounding guests were listening, "is the absolute finality of it all. I have full control of the business now. No more nagging questions about budgets or expenses. We are expanding our international logistics division next quarter, focusing heavily on our Caribbean vendors. The growth potential is staggering." He was literally bragging about his money laundering operation at a cocktail party. The sheer blinding arrogance was breathtaking. He felt so untouchable, so completely insulated by his wealth and his expensive lawyers, that he considered himself above the law. He believed his own lies. He believed the phantom shipping manifests were brilliant business strategies rather than blatant federal felonies. Brittany beamed up at him, looking around the expansive, professionally decorated living room with greedy eyes. "I am just so excited to redecorate this place," she announced to a nearby couple. "Maddie's taste was so boring and conservative. It felt like living in a dentist's waiting room. I am thinking we need to rip out those awful mahogany cabinets and install a custom wine cellar." Donovan promised me a blank check. I was standing 3 blocks away, parked in the shadows of a quiet cul-de-sac, watching the glow of the mansion through the trees. My mother Helen sat in the passenger seat beside me. She had a police scanner app open on her phone, the volume turned down low. We were silent, the tension in the car thick and electric. "They are probably making toasts right now," Helen murmured, her eyes fixed on the distant lights of the house. "Toasting their own brilliance." "Let them toast," I replied, my voice devoid of any emotion. "Let them drink the expensive champagne. Let them plan their wine cellars and their Caribbean expansions. It is the last comfortable night they will ever have." Inside the mansion, the party was reaching a fever pitch. Donovan stepped up onto the raised hearth of the massive stone fireplace, tapping a silver spoon against his crystal Scotch glass. The DJ lowered the music, and the guests turned their attention to the center of the room. Donovan waited for absolute silence, relishing the spotlight. "Thank you all for coming tonight." Donovan projected, his voice booming with unearned confidence. "Tonight we are not just celebrating a new chapter for me and Brittany, we are celebrating the resilience of the Vance family legacy." He paused, letting the words sink in, scanning the faces of his wealthy friends. "We faced a minor obstacle," He continued, a smirk playing on his lips. An individual who tried to tear down everything we built out of pure jealousy and spite. But tonight proves that success and determination always prevail over mediocrity. We protected our assets, we secured our future, and we proved once again that the Vance family cannot be broken. The room erupted in applause. Beatrice wiped a dramatic, non-existent tear from her eye. Brittany clapped enthusiastically, blowing Donovan a kiss. Guests raised their glasses, cheering for the man who had supposedly protected his empire from the greedy middle-class ex-wife. It was a scene of unparalleled hubris. It was a celebration built entirely on a foundation of $15 million in stolen federal funds. Donovan raised his glass high above his head, ready to deliver the final triumphant line of his speech. He opened his mouth, but the words never came out. The heavy custom-built mahogany front doors of the mansion did not just open. They exploded inward with a deafening, terrifying crash that shook the entire foundation of the house. The heavy custom-built mahogany front doors of the mansion did not just open. They exploded inward with a deafening, terrifying crash that shook the entire foundation of the house. A dozen men and women wearing tactical gear and body armor swarmed into the grand foyer. The word IRSCID was emblazoned in stark white letters across the backs of their dark jackets, standing out against the flashy evening wear of the party guests. Close behind them came agents wearing the unmistakable windbreakers of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. "Federal agents! Nobody move hands where we can see them!" A voice boomed over a megaphone, cutting through the sudden, terrified screams of the partygoers. The DJ, paralyzed with fear, fumbled with his equipment. The thumping bass line abruptly cut off, replaced by the chaotic sound of breaking glass as startled guests dropped their champagne flutes. Women shrieked, clutching their pearls and designer dresses, while men in expensive suits instinctively backed away, hands raised in universal surrender. The intoxicating aroma of expensive food was instantly overpowered by the sharp metallic scent of adrenaline and panic. Donovan stood frozen on the raised hearth of the fireplace, his crystal Scotch glass hovering halfway to his mouth. The arrogant smirk had been wiped completely off his face, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. His velvet smoking jacket suddenly looked less like a symbol of power and more like a ridiculous costume. Brittany, who had been blowing him a kiss moments earlier, let out a piercing scream and scrambled backward, tripping over her high heels and falling onto the polished marble floor. Beatrice, standing near the center of the room, swayed on her feet. Her face drained of all color, turning a sickly, ashen gray. She clutched at the collar of her sequined gown, her chest heaving as she began to hyperventilate. The illusion of her untouchable high society life was shattering in real time, broadcast live to the exact people she spent her entire life trying to impress. A tall, imposing man stepped forward from the phalanx of federal agents. He had short cropped hair and the hardened, no-nonsense demeanor of a seasoned investigator. He carried a thick manila folder under his arm. This was Special Agent Harris, the man my mother had entrusted with the master directory. "Donovan Vance." Agent Harris called out, his voice carrying clearly across the silent, terrified room. He did not ask, he demanded. Donovan's shock finally gave way to his deeply ingrained entitlement. He set his glass down hard on the mantelpiece and stepped off the hearth, puffing his chest out in a pathetic display of bravado. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Donovan bellowed, his face turning a furious shade of red. "Do you have any idea whose house you just broke into? I am a prominent businessman. I have the best lawyers in this city on speed dial. You are all going to lose your badges for this." Agent Harris did not even blink. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, holding it up for Donovan to see. "I am Special Agent Harris, with the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division," he stated calmly, ignoring Donovan's empty threats. "I have a federal search warrant for this property and all associated business premises. I also have an arrest warrant for Donovan Vance and Beatrice Vance." The words, "arrest warrant," echoed through the massive room like a death sentence. Beatrice let out a strangled, breathless gasp. Her knees buckled and she collapsed onto a nearby velvet sofa, clutching her chest. "This is a mistake," She wheezed, her eyes wide with terror. "This is a horrible, ridiculous mistake. We have done nothing wrong." "Ma'am, stay where you are," an agent commanded, moving swiftly to secure her position. Donovan, however, was not backing down. His arrogance, fueled by years of getting away with everything, blinded him to the severity of the situation. He jabbed a finger aggressively at Agent Harris. "You are making the biggest mistake of your pathetic career." Donovan spat, his voice echoing loudly. "You think you can just barge in here and intimidate me? I pay more in taxes in a year than you make in a lifetime." Agent Harris offered a small, humorless smile. "Actually, Mr. Vance, according to the evidence we have acquired, you have paid exactly $0 in federal income tax for the last 5 years. You are being charged with multi-million-dollar tax evasion, federal wire fraud, and money laundering." The room collectively gasped. The wealthy guests who had just been cheering for Donovan's success now stared at him with a mixture of horror and revulsion. The word laundering hung in the air, a filthy, undeniable stain on the Vance family legacy. "It's a lie!" Donovan roared, panic finally beginning to edge into his voice. "This is a complete fabrication. Where is your proof? Where is your supposed evidence?" "The evidence is currently being secured by my team in your home office," Agent Harris replied smoothly. "And we already have the master directory of your offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas." Donovan's face went perfectly slack. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking like a ghost. He knew exactly what the master directory was. He knew exactly what it contained. The realization that his impenetrable fortress had been breached hit him with physical force. "You need to call my lawyer," Donovan stammered, his voice losing all its previous bravado. "Right now. Call Arthur Brooks. He will shut this down immediately." "You have the right to an attorney, Mr. Vance," Agent Harris said, motioning to 2 agents standing nearby. "You can call him from holding." The 2 agents stepped forward, pulling handcuffs from their tactical belts. The sharp metallic click of the cuffs locking around Donovan's wrists cut through the silence of the room. It was the sound of absolute finality, the sound of a deeply arrogant man losing everything. Brittany, still sitting on the floor, watched in horrified silence. The glamorous, wealthy life she thought she had secured was evaporating before her eyes. She slowly stood up, her gaze darting toward the back doors of the mansion, clearly calculating her escape. Beatrice was weeping openly now, her mascara running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. "Donovan, do something," she cried out as an agent gently but firmly pulled her arms behind her back. "Tell them it wasn't us. Tell them it was Madeline. She was the accountant. She did this." It was the ultimate desperate act of a coward. When faced with the consequences of her own actions, Beatrice immediately tried to throw me to the wolves. She thought she could simply point a finger and walk away clean. Agent Harris paused, looking at Beatrice with a mixture of pity and contempt. He turned his attention back to Donovan, who was currently being patted down by the agents. "That is an interesting defense, Mrs. Vance," Agent Harris noted, his voice carrying a deadly, icy calm. "Unfortunately for you, we have documentary evidence proving otherwise. We are expecting Mr. Brooks shortly. I highly suggest you save your breath for him." The party was officially over. The guests were quietly and quickly ushered out the front doors by the federal agents, their names and contact information recorded for potential witness interviews. The mansion, once a symbol of immense, unearned wealth, was now an active federal crime scene. The Vance family empire had collapsed in less than 10 minutes, and the hardest fall was still yet to come. The grand foyer of the Bellevue mansion, usually a monument to the Vance family's immense unearned wealth, had been thoroughly transformed into a chaotic federal staging area. Armed agents moved efficiently through the massive space, securing rooms, logging evidence, and maintaining a perimeter around the few remaining occupants. The flashing red and blue lights from the armada of vehicles outside sliced through the tall windows, painting the frantic faces of Donovan, Beatrice, and Brittany in erratic bursts of color. Donovan had been forced to sit on a tufted velvet bench near the sweeping staircase, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back. The velvet smoking jacket, which had looked so regal just 20 minutes ago, was now bunched awkwardly around his shoulders. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling as he tried to project an air of calm defiance that he clearly did not possess. Beatrice remained on the sofa, her face buried in her hands. She was softly crying, muttering something about the terrible mistake that was occurring. Brittany sat as far away from them as the agents would allow. Her arms wrapped defensively around her knees, staring blankly at the marble floor, as if trying to calculate exactly how fast her newly secured lifestyle was evaporating. Special Agent Harris stood near the center of the room, calmly directing his team, while waiting for the inevitable arrival of Donovan's legal counsel. The wait was brief. A frantic knocking sounded at the shattered remnants of the front door. An agent stepped aside, allowing a breathless, sharply dressed man to hurry into the foyer. It was Elias's counterpart from the divorce negotiations, Donovan's highly paid, incredibly arrogant defense attorney, Richard. His usual polished demeanor was completely undone by the sheer terror of walking into an active federal raid. He clutched an expensive leather briefcase, his eyes wide as he took in the scene. "What is the meaning of this?" Richard demanded, his voice cracking slightly before he managed to force it into a semblance of authority. "I am legal counsel for Donovan Vance. I demand to know under what authority my client is being held." Agent Harris turned slowly, his expression devoid of any intimidation. He did not raise his voice. He simply spoke with the absolute weight of the United States federal government behind him. "Special Agent Harris, IRS Criminal Investigation Division," he stated, offering a brief nod. "Your client is being held under a federal arrest warrant for multi-million-dollar tax evasion, wire fraud, and money laundering. We are executing a search warrant for this property, which we have reason to believe was leveraged to fund illicit operations." Richard blanched, his professional mask slipping for a moment before he recovered. He straightened his tie and stepped closer to Donovan, clearly trying to project an air of control. "These charges are absurd," Richard scoffed, adopting a patronizing tone. "My client runs a legitimate import-export business. Any financial irregularities are the result of basic administrative errors, or more likely the incompetence of his former spouse, who handled the accounting. This is a massive overreach, Agent Harris. I will have this entire raid thrown out by tomorrow morning." Donovan, emboldened by the arrival of his lawyer, leaned forward as much as the handcuffs would allow. "Exactly," he sneered, a desperate, ugly smirk returning to his face. "This is all Madeline. She was the forensic accountant. She handled the books. If there is a problem, it is because she screwed up. You are arresting the wrong people. She set this whole thing up because she is a bitter, jealous ex-wife who couldn't handle that I left her." Agent Harris listened to Donovan's frantic attempts to shift the blame with a look of profound, chilling amusement. He reached into the thick manila folder tucked under his arm and slowly pulled out a single, heavily stapled document. He held it up, the stark white paper contrasting sharply with the dim lighting of the foyer. "It is fascinating that you bring up your former spouse, Mr. Vance," Agent Harris said, his voice smooth and lethally calm. "Because we received an anonymous tip earlier this week containing the master directory of your offshore accounts. It seems whoever sent it was very eager for us to see exactly how your business operates." Donovan's face tightened, a flicker of genuine fear finally breaking through his arrogant facade. "I told you it was Madeline. She had access to the server. She probably fabricated those files to frame me. She is a vindictive, unstable woman. You cannot use evidence provided by a disgruntled ex-wife." "Oh, the evidence is quite compelling," Agent Harris countered, stepping closer to Richard. "The offshore wire transfers, the phantom shipping manifests the leverage on this property. It is all meticulously documented. But that is not even the most interesting part of the file we received." Agent Harris handed the thick document to Richard. It was the finalized, judge-approved divorce decree. "I believe you are familiar with this document, counselor," Agent Harris said, watching Richard's face intently. "Your firm drafted the primary settlement agreement, if I am not mistaken." Richard frowned, looking down at the heavy stack of papers. "Yes, this is the finalized divorce decree. The judge signed off on it on Monday. It completely severs Madeline's ties to the business and this property. It proves she is angry about losing everything. It proves her motive." "I suggest you turn to the final pages, counselor," Agent Harris instructed, his voice dropping to a harsh, commanding tone. "Specifically, Appendix 4B. Richard looked annoyed, but he flipped through the thick document, the sound of paper rustling loudly in the quiet room. He reached the final pages, his eyes scanning the dense boilerplate text he had clearly ignored just days ago. He found Appendix 4B. He began to read. I watched through the dark-tinted windows of the unmarked car parked across the street, a small pair of binoculars pressed to my eyes. Helen sat beside me, her breath held tight. We could not hear the words, but we could see the exact moment the realization hit. Richard's face did not just go pale, it turned a sickly translucent white. His hands gripping the heavy document began to tremble uncontrollably. He stopped reading, his eyes darting frantically across the text, as if hoping the words would magically rearrange themselves into something less devastating. He looked up at Donovan, his expression a horrific mix of disbelief, sheer terror, and dawning comprehension. "What is it?" Donovan demanded, his voice cracking with sudden, overwhelming panic. "What does it say, Richard? Tell them it proves Madeline is responsible." Richard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He looked at Agent Harris, then back down at the document. He cleared his throat, his voice shaking visibly when he finally spoke. Appendix 4B. Richard read aloud, the words echoing ominously through the grand foyer. Indemnification and hold harmless agreement. The petitioner, Donovan Vance, in exchange for receiving 100% equity in the marital business and real property, knowingly and willingly assumes 100% of all past, present, and future liabilities associated with said assets. Richard paused, his voice faltering. He looked at Donovan, who was staring back with an expression of blank, uncomprehending shock. It continues. Richard choked out, his eyes dropping back to the page. The petitioner assumes sole responsibility for all civil penalties, criminal restitution, federal and state tax liabilities, unpaid corporate taxes, and any fines resulting from federal audits or investigations. The petitioner legally declares that the respondent, Madeline Vance, has no operational knowledge or financial responsibility for any misdeeds committed by the company. By signing this document, the petitioner voluntarily assumes all federal and criminal liability for the business operations dating back to their inception. The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying. Donovan sat on the velvet bench, his mouth hanging open. The words hit him like a physical blow, driving the breath from his lungs. The realization crashed over him in a series of agonizing waves. He had not just signed a divorce decree. He had signed a full, legally binding confession. He had voluntarily assumed 100% of the responsibility for a $15 million federal fraud operation. He had shielded me completely, and he had done it willingly, eagerly, blinded by his own arrogance and greed. I didn't read it. Donovan whispered, his voice small and pathetic. I didn't read the addendums. I just signed it. Ignorance is not a valid legal defense, Mr. Vance, Agent Harris stated coldly. Especially not when you paid your attorney to finalize the agreement. Richard looked at the document, the weight of his own profound negligence crushing down on him. He had failed to review the final pages. He had let his client sign a lethal trap. His career, his reputation, everything was ruined in an instant. Donovan looked at his lawyer, his eyes wide with a terror so pure it was almost beautiful to witness. Richard, fix this. Tell them I didn't mean it. Tell them she tricked me. I can't, Richard whispered, his voice devoid of any hope. It's a finalized court order. You signed it, Donovan. You legally confessed to everything. Donovan slumped forward, his head dropping toward his knees. The velvet smoking jacket hung loosely on his defeated frame. Beatrice let out a low, agonizing wail from the sofa, finally realizing that her son's arrogance had doomed them both. The Vance family empire, built on lies and stolen money, had been completely dismantled by a single, carefully crafted page of fine print. They had walked right into the execution chamber, and they had locked the door themselves. Donovan collapsed inward, his shoulders hitching in silent sobs. The crushing weight of the federal indictment had completely broken him. He was no longer the arrogant CEO throwing a lavish divorce party. He was just a terrified man wearing a ridiculous velvet jacket, handcuffed in his own foyer, realizing he was about to lose a decade of his life to a federal penitentiary. Beatrice continued her high-pitched wailing on the sofa. She kept repeating that she was a prominent socialite, that she sat on charity boards, and that the IRS was making a catastrophic mistake. "I am a senior citizen," Beatrice shrieked, struggling against the flex cuffs an agent was securing around her wrists. "You cannot do this to me. I demand to speak to the governor." "You can speak to a federal judge at your arraignment on Monday morning, ma'am," Agent Harris replied, his voice completely devoid of sympathy. "You co-signed over a dozen fraudulent commercial loan applications. You are listed as the primary guarantor on the offshore shell companies. Your signature is on the money laundering transfers." Beatrice's wails turned into a breathless, panicked squeak. The reality of her situation had finally breached her delusion. She looked at Richard, her highly paid lawyer, with wild, desperate eyes. "Richard, do something, make them stop." Richard took a slow step backward, physically distancing himself from his former clients. "I advise you both to remain completely silent," he said, his voice trembling. "Do not say another word. I will see what I can do regarding bail." He turned and practically ran out the shattered front doors, eager to escape the radioactive fallout of his own profound negligence. In the midst of this complete structural collapse, Brittany finally made her move. She had been sitting on the floor near the grand staircase watching the Vance family empire burn to the ground. She looked at Donovan, then at the federal agents, and then down at the expensive diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist. The math was brutally simple. There was no mansion. There was no unlimited credit card. There was no luxury lifestyle waiting for her. There was only massive debt, federal prison, and a whole lot of very angry government agents. Brittany slowly pushed herself up from the marble floor. She kicked off her expensive high heels, abandoning them near the stairs. She clutched her sequined cocktail dress tightly around her body and began backing away toward the kitchen hallway. Neither Donovan nor Beatrice noticed her retreating. They were too consumed by their own impending incarceration. I watched through the binoculars from my car as Brittany sprinted out the back door of the mansion, her bare feet hitting the wet grass. She did not look back. She ran straight toward the dense tree line at the edge of the property, disappearing into the dark Seattle night, leaving Donovan completely alone with the consequences of his actions. It was the ultimate pathetic end to their sordid affair. Inside the mansion, the chaos was escalating. Vanessa, Donovan's sister, had been hiding in the formal dining room when the raid began. She finally gathered enough courage to peek her head around the corner, her face pale and streaked with tears. Seeing her mother and brother handcuffed and surrounded by federal agents broke whatever fragile composure she had left. Vanessa scrambled back into the dining room, pulling her phone from her clutch. Her hands were shaking violently as she dialed her husband's number. She needed Jamal. She needed his calm logic, his steady presence, and most importantly, she needed his clean, untainted financial resources to bail her family out of this nightmare. The phone rang 3 times before Jamal picked up. "Jamal! Oh my God! Jamal, you have to get here right now!" Vanessa screamed into the phone, her voice hysterical. "The FBI is here. The IRS is here. They arrested Donovan. They arrested Mom. You have to come help us." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. When Jamal finally spoke, his voice was chillingly calm, completely detached from the frantic panic of his wife. "I am not coming, Vanessa." Jamal said, his words sharp and deliberate. "What are you talking about?" Vanessa shrieked, pacing wildly around the dining room table. "My family is being arrested. They are taking the house. We need money for bail. We need your credit cards." "You need to listen to me very carefully," Jamal replied, cutting through her hysteria. "I warned you about your family's toxicity. I told you I would not be dragged down by their arrogance and their complete lack of morals. You chose them. You chose to sit at that dinner table and laugh while they destroyed Maddie. You made your choice." "Jamal, please," Vanessa sobbed, finally realizing the depth of her isolation. "I am your wife." "Not anymore," Jamal stated coldly. "My lawyer filed the divorce papers yesterday afternoon. All of my personal accounts, my salary, and my investments have been legally separated and locked down. You do not have access to a single cent of my money. I will not let your family's criminal enterprise ruin my life or my career." Vanessa let out a strangled gasp, dropping the phone onto the dining room table. The line went dead. Jamal had completely severed ties. He had built an impenetrable firewall around his life, just as I had warned him to do. Vanessa was now entirely alone, trapped in a sinking ship with no lifeboats left. She stumbled out of the dining room and collapsed onto the floor near her mother, sobbing uncontrollably. The Vance family, once the loudest, most arrogant presence in Bellevue, was now reduced to a puddle of weeping, terrified criminals sitting on the floor of a crime scene. Agent Harris signaled to his team, "All right, let's move them out. Secure the premises." The agents hauled Donovan and Beatrice to their feet. Donovan looked broken, his eyes vacant and staring straight ahead as he was marched toward the shattered front doors. Beatrice continued to weep, her heavy gold jewelry clinking loudly against her handcuffs. I watched from the safety of my car as the federal agents escorted my ex-husband and my former mother-in-law down the grand stone steps of the mansion. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated their faces, broadcasting their profound humiliation to the entire neighborhood. They were loaded into the back of separate, unmarked black SUVs. Helen reached over and gently squeezed my hand. The grip was firm and full of fierce maternal pride. We sat in silence for another 5 minutes, watching the taillights of the federal convoy disappear down the winding, tree-lined street. The Bellevue mansion, once a symbol of my oppression, was now dark and empty, wrapped in bright yellow crime scene tape. The house of cards had completely collapsed, and it was a beautiful sight to behold. The following Monday morning, the Seattle business district awoke to a seismic shockwave. The local news stations led their morning broadcasts with aerial footage of the Bellevue mansion surrounded by crime scene tape. The headlines were relentless and completely unforgiving. Prominent Seattle import-export firm raided in massive federal money laundering probe. The anchors detailed the allegations with clinical precision: $15 million in offshore tax evasion, wire fraud, and the use of a family business as a criminal front. I sat in my small apartment drinking my coffee and watching the news coverage. It was a masterclass in swift, brutal federal justice. They showed a brief, humiliating clip of Donovan being escorted into the federal courthouse for his arraignment. He was no longer wearing a bespoke Italian suit. He was wearing an ill-fitting standard-issue orange jumpsuit. His hands were cuffed to a chain around his waist. He looked exhausted, terrified, and profoundly diminished. The arrogant smirk that had defined his entire existence was completely gone. Beatrice followed closely behind him, her face hidden behind a large magazine held up by her newly appointed, visibly stressed public defender. The news anchor confirmed that Richard, their previous high-priced attorney, had formally withdrawn as counsel, citing an insurmountable conflict of interest. He had effectively abandoned them to the federal wolves to save his own legal license. The immediate financial fallout was catastrophic. The federal government, utilizing the powers of civil asset forfeiture, moved with blinding speed. By Tuesday afternoon, the Bellevue mansion was officially seized by the Department of Justice. The luxury cars were impounded, the corporate bank accounts were completely frozen, and the personal executive accounts were drained to satisfy the initial tax liens. The Vance family, who had spent decades looking down on the working class, was now entirely reliant on the public defender's office. But the most critical consequence of the raid was playing out not in federal court, but back in the King County family court. The moment the federal indictment was unsealed, Elias sprang into action. He filed an emergency ex parte motion with the family court judge, the exact same judge who had finalized our divorce just days prior. Elias presented the indictment, which explicitly detailed Donovan's active role in a multi-million-dollar criminal syndicate. He highlighted the fact that Donovan was facing a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in federal prison. He pointed out that the Bellevue mansion, the primary residence listed in the original custody agreement, was now an active crime scene seized by the government. The judge, clearly horrified that he had unknowingly granted primary custody to an active federal criminal, did not hesitate. The ruling was swift and absolute. Based on the clear and present danger to the minor children and the father's impending long-term incarceration, The court immediately revoked Donovan's custody rights. An emergency order was issued reverting full sole physical and legal custody of Leo and Sophie back to me. It was permanent. Donovan would never have the legal authority to use my children as leverage again. I held the signed, stamped emergency custody order in my hands. The paper felt heavier than the entire 300-page divorce decree. It was the ultimate victory. I had secured my children's safety, and I had done it without dragging them through a vicious, traumatic custody battle. They were still happily riding horses and making lanyards at Camp Thunderbird, completely unaware that their father's empire had burned to the ground. The legal consequences continued to ripple outward, destroying the last remnants of Donovan's life. Brittany, the 25-year-old mistress who had envisioned a life of endless luxury, realized very quickly that loyalty to a broke, federally indicted felon was not in her best interest. According to Elias, who had contacts within the prosecutor's office, Brittany had immediately sought immunity. She walked right into the federal building on Tuesday afternoon and offered to testify against Donovan regarding the expensive gifts and luxury travel he had purchased with laundered funds. She traded him for her own freedom without a second thought. Vanessa, having been thoroughly warned and subsequently abandoned by Jamal, attempted to salvage her own social standing by publicly disavowing her mother and brother. She gave a tearful, highly orchestrated interview to a local gossip blog, claiming she had been completely manipulated and had absolutely no knowledge of the family's illicit activities. Her performance, however, fell entirely flat. Jamal's lawyer had moved with surgical precision, officially filing for divorce and securing Jamal's assets in an impenetrable legal trust. Vanessa was left with nothing but her tarnished maiden name and the profound realization that she was entirely alone. She was forced to move into a tiny, overpriced studio apartment far away from the elite social circles she had once commanded. By the end of the week, the Vance family business was officially dissolved. The federal government seized the remaining inventory, which turned out to be mostly cheap, imported junk used to inflate the shipping manifests. The employees were let go, the warehouse was locked, and the corporate entity was struck from the state registry. I watched it all unfold from the quiet safety of my apartment. There was no grand confrontation. There was no screaming match. There was only the cold, undeniable logic of the law dismantling a deeply corrupt family. Donovan had wanted to crush me. He had wanted to leave me with absolutely nothing. Instead, he had handed me the perfect weapon, and I had simply allowed his own immense arrogance to pull the trigger. I picked up the phone and dialed my mother. Helen answered on the first ring. "The emergency custody order just came through," I told her, my voice steady and clear. "I have full sole custody. It is completely over." I heard a long, satisfying sigh on the other end of the line. "You played it perfectly, Maddie. You gave them enough rope to hang themselves and you walked away clean." "I could not have done it without you, Mom," I said, feeling a deep, profound wave of gratitude for the woman they had so viciously mocked. "You taught me how to read the fine print." "And you taught them," Helen replied softly, "that a middle-class auditor is the most dangerous person you can ever underestimate." The following Monday morning, the Seattle business district awoke to a seismic shockwave. The local news stations led their morning broadcasts with aerial footage of the Bellevue mansion surrounded by crime scene tape. The headlines were relentless and completely unforgiving. Prominent Seattle import-export firm raided in massive federal money laundering probe. The anchors detailed the allegations with clinical precision: $15 million in offshore tax evasion, wire fraud, and the use of a family business as a criminal front. I sat in my small apartment drinking my coffee and watching the news coverage. It was a masterclass in swift, brutal federal justice. They showed a brief, humiliating clip of Donovan being escorted into the federal courthouse for his arraignment. He was no longer wearing a bespoke Italian suit. He was wearing an ill-fitting standard-issue orange jumpsuit. His hands were cuffed to a chain around his waist. He looked exhausted, terrified, and profoundly diminished. The arrogant smirk that had defined his entire existence was completely gone. Beatrice followed closely behind him, her face hidden behind a large magazine held up by her newly appointed, visibly stressed public defender. The news anchor confirmed that Richard, their previous high-priced attorney, had formally withdrawn as counsel, citing an insurmountable conflict of interest. He had effectively abandoned them to the federal wolves to save his own legal license. The immediate financial fallout was catastrophic. The federal government, utilizing the powers of civil asset forfeiture, moved with blinding speed. By Tuesday afternoon, the Bellevue mansion was officially seized by the Department of Justice. The luxury cars were impounded, the corporate bank accounts were completely frozen, and the personal executive accounts were drained to satisfy the initial tax liens. The Vance family, who had spent decades looking down on the working class, was now entirely reliant on the public defender's office. But the most critical consequence of the raid was playing out not in federal court, but back in the King County Family Court. The moment the federal indictment was unsealed, Elias sprang into action. He filed an emergency ex parte motion with the family court judge, the exact same judge who had finalized our divorce just days prior. Elias presented the indictment, which explicitly detailed Donovan's active role in a multi-million-dollar criminal syndicate. He highlighted the fact that Donovan was facing a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in federal prison. He pointed out that the Bellevue mansion, the primary residence listed in the original custody agreement, was now an active crime scene seized by the government. The judge, clearly horrified that he had unknowingly granted primary custody to an active federal criminal, did not hesitate. The ruling was swift and absolute. Based on the clear and present danger to the minor children and the father's impending long-term incarceration, the court immediately revoked Donovan's custody rights. An emergency order was issued reverting full sole physical and legal custody of Leo and Sophie back to me. It was permanent. Donovan would never have the legal authority to use my children as leverage again. I held the signed, stamped emergency custody order in my hands. The paper felt heavier than the entire 300-page divorce decree. It was the ultimate victory. I had secured my children's safety, and I had done it without dragging them through a vicious, traumatic custody battle. They were still happily riding horses and making lanyards at Camp Thunderbird, completely unaware that their father's empire had burned to the ground. The legal consequences continued to ripple outward, destroying the last remnants of Donovan's life. Brittany, the 25-year-old mistress who had envisioned a life of endless luxury, realized very quickly that loyalty to a broke federally indicted felon was not in her best interest. According to Elias, who had contacts within the prosecutor's office, Brittany had immediately sought immunity. She walked right into the federal building on Tuesday afternoon and offered to testify against Donovan regarding the expensive gifts and luxury travel he had purchased with laundered funds. She traded him for her own freedom without a second thought. Vanessa, having been thoroughly warned and subsequently abandoned by Jamal, attempted to salvage her own social standing by publicly disavowing her mother and brother. She gave a tearful, highly orchestrated interview to a local gossip blog, claiming she had been completely manipulated and had absolutely no knowledge of the family's illicit activities. Her performance, however, fell entirely flat. Jamal's lawyer had moved with surgical precision, officially filing for divorce and securing Jamal's assets in an impenetrable legal trust. Vanessa was left with nothing but her tarnished maiden name and the profound realization that she was entirely alone. She was forced to move into a tiny, overpriced studio apartment far away from the elite social circles she had once commanded. By the end of the week, the Vance family business was officially dissolved. The federal government seized the remaining inventory, which turned out to be mostly cheap imported junk used to inflate the shipping manifests. The employees were let go, the warehouse was locked, and the corporate entity was struck from the state registry. I watched it all unfold from the quiet safety of my apartment. There was no grand confrontation. There was no screaming match. There was only the cold, undeniable logic of the law dismantling a deeply corrupt family. Donovan had wanted to crush me. He had wanted to leave me with absolutely nothing. Instead, he had handed me the perfect weapon, and I had simply allowed his own immense arrogance to pull the trigger. I picked up the phone and dialed my mother. Helen answered on the first ring. The emergency custody order just came through. I told her, my voice steady and clear. I have full sole custody. It is completely over. I heard a long, satisfying sigh on the other end of the line. You played it perfectly, Maddie. You gave them enough rope to hang themselves, and you walked away clean. I could not have done it without you, Mom, I said, feeling a deep, profound wave of gratitude for the woman they had so viciously mocked. You taught me how to read the fine print. And you taught them, Helen replied softly, that a middle-class auditor is the most dangerous person you can ever underestimate. I ended the call with a genuine, unburdened laugh. It was the first true, effortless laugh I had experienced in what felt like an entire lifetime. I placed my phone on the sleek, pristine quartz countertop of my brand new kitchen. I looked around the expansive, sunlit living area. This was not the sprawling, excessively gaudy Bellevue mansion. This was a stunning, modern penthouse apartment located right in the heart of downtown Seattle. It featured floor-to-ceiling windows, clean architectural lines, and a sweeping view of the city skyline. And the most beautiful part of this entire space was that it was paid for entirely by my own honest savings. I had earned every single square foot of this home through years of meticulous, exhausting work as a senior forensic accountant. There were no hidden commercial liens attached to this property. There were no offshore shell companies funding the mortgage. There was absolutely no dirty money, and there were zero toxic in-laws holding spare keys to my front door. My mother Helen walked out from the kitchen carrying 2 steaming mugs of black coffee. We stepped out onto the spacious balcony together. I took the mug from her hand, inhaling the rich, grounding aroma of the dark roast. We stood side by side, leaning against the glass railing, looking out over the emerald green waters of Puget Sound. The Seattle morning was crisp, breezy, and brilliantly clear. The violent storm that had completely washed away the Vance family empire had finally passed, leaving nothing but bright, unobstructed skies in its wake. I spoke with Jamal this morning, Helen said, her voice carrying over the gentle hum of the city traffic below. His lawyer finalized the separation of his assets just in time. The federal freeze hit Vanessa's accounts late last night. She is officially penniless, but Jamal's tech salary and his personal investments are completely shielded. He is safe. He deserved to get out clean, I replied, taking a slow sip of my coffee. He was the only one in that house with a functional moral compass. And Beatrice? Helen asked, a knowing, highly satisfied glint in her seasoned investigator eyes. Currently complaining about the thread count of the sheets in federal holding, I am sure. I smiled, looking out at the ferry boats crossing the water. We shared a quiet, deeply satisfying moment of total vindication. The execution of the legal trap had been flawless. It was a masterpiece of financial justice. A few hours later, the sound of the private elevator chiming in the hallway signaled the arrival I had been anticipating all morning. I set my coffee mug down on the table and hurried to the front door. I pulled it open just as the private transport driver brought 2 heavy sticker-covered trunks into the foyer. Stepping out from behind the driver were the 2 most important people in my entire world. Leo and Sophie burst through the doorway, their faces tanned and glowing with pure, unadulterated childhood joy. They smelled like campfire smoke, pine needles, and fresh mountain air. I dropped to my knees on the hardwood floor and gathered them both into a fierce, overwhelming embrace. I buried my face in their shoulders, holding them so tightly my chest physically ached with gratitude. They were perfectly safe. Because of the careful, deliberate manipulation of Donovan's massive ego, my children had spent the last month riding horses and learning archery at Camp Thunderbird. They were completely insulated from the horrific, chaotic federal raid. They had not seen the flashing lights, they had not heard the screaming, and they had not watched their father get marched out of his home in handcuffs. They were entirely shielded from the traumatic shattering of the Vance family legacy. Leo immediately began talking at lightning speed, proudly describing how he had learned to build a real fire without using any matches. Sophie beamed up at me and displayed a colorful woven friendship bracelet she had made carefully, tying it around my wrist. They did not ask about the Bellevue mansion. They did not ask where their father was. They were simply thrilled to be home with their mother, exploring the exciting rooms of our beautiful new apartment. I told them to go pick out their bedrooms and start unpacking their incredible summer camp stories. Later that afternoon, the penthouse was filled with the comforting, chaotic sounds of children happily playing. Helen had taken Sophie into the kitchen to bake a batch of chocolate chip cookies. I was sitting on the plush living room sofa, organizing some client files for my upcoming work week. The large flat-screen television mounted on the wall was playing the local news broadcast at a low volume. The anchor's serious tone caught my attention. The screen flashed to a courtroom sketch artist's rendering of Donovan and Beatrice sitting at a defense table. The bold headline at the bottom of the screen read, "Bail denied for Bellevue import-export executives." I unmuted the television and watched the brief update. The federal judge had officially deemed Donovan Vance an extreme flight risk due to the massive complex offshore financial networks he had attempted to conceal from the government. He was remanded to federal custody pending his criminal trial. There would be no luxury house arrest. There would be no comfortable ankle monitor. Donovan was going to sit in a bleak concrete federal cell until his sentencing date. The reporter mentioned that his mother Beatrice was facing identical restrictions and was currently undergoing medical evaluation after a highly dramatic panic attack in the courtroom. I watched the screen with absolute icy indifference. There was no pity in my heart for the man who had tried to leave me destitute and rip my children away from me out of pure malicious spite. There was no sympathy for the woman who had viciously mocked my mother and my background at every opportunity. They had built their entire lives on blinding arrogance and stolen money. They thought they could crush anyone who got in their way. Now they were paying the ultimate inescapable price for their greed. I picked up my coffee mug and took one last slow, deliberate sip. The taste of a sweet, bloodless victory was perfect. I picked up the television remote and pressed the power button. The screen went completely black, instantly cutting off the image of Donovan's ruined life. I was entirely done looking at him. I was entirely done thinking about him. He was a closed file. I turned around and walked over to the center of the living room rug. Leo had just finished setting up a complex multi-level board game he had been begging to play since he stepped off the bus. Sophie was happily sorting the colorful game pieces into neat little piles. I sat down cross-legged on the soft rug right between my two beautiful, perfectly safe children. I looked at their smiling faces and felt a profound, overwhelming wave of peace wash over my entire soul. I had protected my family. I had secured my financial future. I had completely dismantled a toxic, multi-million-dollar criminal empire without ever raising my voice or losing my dignity. I had won the entire war with a single perfectly calculated signature. "All right," I said, smiling warmly at my son. "It is your turn to roll the dice." The stories above teach us a profound lesson. Biology does not automatically earn the title of family. When those who should protect us instead choose cruelty, manipulation, and conditional love, walking away is not a surrender. It is an act of profound courage. Setting firm boundaries against toxic relatives allows us to reclaim our self-worth and build a chosen family rooted in genuine respect. True peace comes from defining your own value rather than seeking it from people determined to diminish you. Share your own journey of setting healthy boundaries and finding your chosen family in the comments below.